everybody. This is Marianne Mohanraj and Ben Rosenbaum trying to put together the second possible episode. We're not sure how this is all going to play out of our podcast, but this is our second recording session. We have, I think, tentatively come up with a title. Mohanraj and Rosenbaum are humans. If Ben is
I
okay
feel
with
like it's
that.
pretty accurate.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is, as you said, it sets a nice low bar.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a nice bar. No, there were, yeah. I reserve the right to also be an alien. I mean, I'm not, I'm not, I don't want to be pinned down to just human, but
just humans.
certainly, I feel like that's included in my remit.
That's right. At least some of the time we are human.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe
exactly.
all of the time human and sometimes somewhat alien.
Yeah.
We had talked about some of the, people have been started asking me like, so what is this podcast about? And I'm like, well, we're humanists, so it can be about everything. And that's a nice wide thing. I do think that we're likely to talk about certain things more than others. So obviously we both write science fiction and fantasy. You write fantasy? Now I'm
Yes,
blanking. Yeah, you
I
do.
write
You do write
fantasy.
fantasy. Right.
Mhm.
So we both write science fiction fantasy as well as more mainstream realist type
You
stuff.
weren't you read, wait, were you at the
I
last,
did. I did.
what
I read
critique
that.
group were we at together last?
I
The
read that.
one
I
with
read that piece of yours.
the
Um
witch in the bottle.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fantasy.
So So yes, you do sometimes do fantasy, and then and we have both been sort of immersed in that field for a long time, and going to conventions, talking to other writers, reading a lot. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that.
Mhm.
Um, Other things that we tend to talk about, I would say, are community and
Mhm.
ethics, perhaps.
Mhm.
Uh,
Culture.
Culture. Yeah, culture is probably
But
a
I
nice,
mean,
big, broad
I don't,
thing.
yeah, but I don't know that, I mean, it's kind of like, it reminds me of this sort of definitional question when people argue about science fiction and fantasy, and they're like, it's science fiction if it does this, if it meets this much plausibility. If you have this
Yeah.
much plausibility, you are high enough to ride this ride. And that always strikes me as odd. Like, by that
Hmm.
metric, The Life of Brian is a science fiction story, right? Because in the middle of The Life of Brian,
Hmm.
aliens come. There's one scene, like, it's all
Oh
about
yeah.
this sort of history of this guy in ancient Judea, and it's full. The whole movie's jokes about, politics of Rome and Judea.
Yeah.
Except there's this one sequence where, just as a gag, these aliens pick up Brian, and like he goes on this crazy, like, 2-second ride, and then
Yeah.
gets dumped somewhere. It's a gag.
Well,
It's a sight gag.
so then
But
let me ask you.
by the definitional version, that would make it science fiction. Anyway, sorry.
No, I sort of wonder about this because so I have this in Bodies in Motion, which is, I would say, for the most part, a realist book. These 20 linked short stories that started in Sri Lanka in the 1940s and come to the present day. There is one story, Wood and Flesh, in which the
Hmm.
protagonist develops stigmata, and it
Hmm.
is left an open question whether they're self-inflicted or whether this is an
Hmm.
actual magical realist manifestation, right? By
Although,
which,
aren't stigmata a thing that really happened? That's a third variant. Isn't that
well, yes,
actually a
right.
thing?
So
We
that's the
get.
third thing, right? So if, and then the third thing is that is this something that her mind could essentially through some sort of biofeedback mechanism create,
Mhm.
right? So is it something that is physically self-inflicted, something that's mentally self-inflicted, if that's possible,
Mhm.
and or is this
Yeah,
magical slash miraculous, right? But anyway, leaving all of that, the possibilities aside, since the story does not define it and makes it possible that it's a miracle, then you can, I think,
mhm.
argue that the entire book is a fantasy novel,
Sure.
right?
Also, Jane
um
Eyre. Same with Jane
yeah,
Eyre, right?
yeah,
There's
right,
there's like the
yeah,
telepathy scene in Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre is fantasy novel, right? By this, but obviously I think this is silly. The reason I brought up this sort of definitional, like, this
yeah,
is the thing that makes it the thing, is I don't think that's how genre and works. I think genre is a way of talking about reader experience, and I think that, first of all, there aren't borders because it's not this or that. It's like, has a little strands. Like Jane Eyre has a little fillip of. It's like cooking. It's not like the meal
hmm
becomes salt if you add a little salt. There's a dash of fantasy in Jane Eyre. That doesn't make it fantasy. That makes it, the stew that it is with a dash of fantasy.
it
It's
doesn't.
like a thread.
Yeah, sort of, kind of. I mean, I would mostly agree with that. but I don't know.
About
There
Jane
is a
Eyre or
certain
about stews?
just the idea that like okay, there's a telepathy moment in that book.
Yeah.
There's the magical realist moment in my book, the or miraculous moment, but you can sort of, I think, also make the argument that when that happens, it like it opens up another dimension to the universe, right? To the world and to the text. Suddenly
Hmm.
you have to now read everything that came before as
Yeah.
happening within a magical realist framework, even if nothing manifests, right? Like it changes the possibilities of everything.
Yeah,
So,
I like that. I like that point, and I think you're very right. Like that sort of reminds me of Delaney's about 57, 80 words. Like every single word changes your reading of all the words before, right? You know the
right.
opening of that essay where it's like the red sun
Which one is that?
rose.
Oh, I don't know if I have it. Which book is that in?
It,
Do you
it's
remember?
about I don't know one of those essay books, the Joel Hinch, not the Joel
Yeah,
Hinch,
yeah, it might
one
be
of
the
those.
Joel Hinch. I read those, I
But
read those in high school. I need to go back now that I know what I'm doing.
It's a brilliant
So,
essay, and what it says he takes you through the reader's experience of reading a single sentence where it's like the, if you could say. So
mhm,
now we have the, so that's like a gray indefinite, like there's a blob of, like the is a definite article, so there's like something that's not the thing and something, so there's a gray semicircle, right? Because
mhm.
there's things that are not the, and then and then it says the red, and it's like, oh, red, okay, well it's like a balloon or something. So now the blob is red, right?
Yeah, yeah,
In your
yeah.
field of vision. The red sun. Oh, okay, it's a red sun. It's like setting, or something. Like it's the red sun rose, or
Mhm.
right, and then it's like, okay, the red sun rose. Okay, so sunrise is red. Red sun rose. The another the. We have another thing. We have a red sun.
Yeah,
We have
yeah,
another gray.
yeah.
The blue. Okay, blue. It's like a bluebird, a blue sky. What's blue? Something blue. The blue, and then the last word is like the red sun rose. The blue descended. And it's like, whoa, now
Mhm.
there's two suns. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Now we're on
yeah,
a
yeah,
planet.
yeah.
Like that. Once you get to descended, all of a sudden it wipes your entire image of this sort of bucolic
Right,
sunset scene, and now you're on like Tatooine or wherever. And
right.
so his point is, it's not like, yeah, I mean precisely what you were saying. I mean,
Yeah.
I agree vehemently with your objection to my earlier point, which is that every word changes the whole text. So yes, right? It's
Yeah.
both and. Yes, on the one hand, every word changes the whole text. On the other hand, what I'm trying to get at is, um, you
No,
know,
but there's a
uh,
difference. There's a difference between a text that wholeheartedly embraces a genre and a text that I don't know, has a tinge, a dabble, a hint
I'm not
of
even sure.
something laying over it too, right?
I
So
mean,
like
I think it's a little
yeah.
unfair of the text to ask of the text that it takes a position towards genre, that it wholeheartedly embraces the genre. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, like
I
but
think
like
genre is a thing we do to text, not that they do.
no, but they
Like,
function differently, right? Jane Eyre, right? Like the Jane Eyre is a gothic, right? So
yeah,
it it is generally realistic. It has this telepathic moment. It also has this kind of like um miasma, right, of spookiness
yeah,
hovering over
yeah,
the entire
right.
text,
Gothic
right?
spookiness. Yeah.
So so those are kind of like fantastic. So those are sort of there's a certain amount of fantasticalness to it.
But what I'm
But
saying is those
hold
those
on,
categories. Yeah, go ahead.
hold on. The as opposed to because I think it's easier to talk about this with concrete examples. Something like Midnight's Children. Have you read?
No.
Midnight. So you got to go read Midnight's Children. And also, before we leave today, I want you to make a note about finding out which Delaney essay it was, so that we can cite it
Yeah.
here in the podcast.
I think it was
But
about 57, 80 words. But yeah, like Darius should
Midnight's
make a
Children
bibliographical note.
is Midnight's Children is uh, Rushdie's one of his best books. It is magical realist. It's a huge, important post-colonial lit novel, but it also has, from the get-go, the premise of the book is that all the children born in the hour after India declared independence are
Hmm.
born with powers,
Hmm.
right? So they have
Cool.
and each one has a different power, and the closer they are to that moment of independence, the stronger the power is.
That's
So
great. Why has there
it
not been a comics adaptation of this book?
I don't know.
feels like feels like
It's a
there should be
it's a
one.
terrific book, but it's it is long. The prose is very ornate. It is dense, so
Mm.
it's maybe not accessible to all readers. But concept wise, I would
I
say
mean,
like
clearly that's not just a fantasy book; it's a superhero book.
Yes. Ooh, well,
I mean,
even with so,
just when you're
but yeah, no, I think that's fair because and in fact, it's about this guy. It's told from the point of view of the person who was born second, not the most powerful, but the second most
Mm,
powerful, right?
okay.
And
Yeah.
um, and they have powers. I mean, like they're not all good powers, right? Like some of them are like they're
Mhm.
women who are so beautiful that they kill
Mm.
men who look at them or
Mhm.
turn them to stone or
Mhm.
something. But there are people who can do things like. Uh, connect all the children of midnight together telepathically, and then there are
Mhm.
people who can travel in time and so on. So I would say that book is, even though it's told in a very realist manner in terms of um, like it's really embedded in details of like the pickle factory that the protagonist's family runs, right?
Mhm.
And
Sure.
but it's constantly engaging with the fantastical. And I think like Michael Chabon's work is often done in a similar vein. And I don't know, I think that's so when you say that the book
But let me
that genre
elaborate
that
what I
we
mean.
I don't think we impose genre on the book. I
No,
think the
yeah,
book
no,
is
but
engaged in a genre project, right? Like
here's let me allow me to
okay,
to
go
disagree.
ahead.
Here's my thing. It is perfectly legitimate as a 21st century person to look at Jane Eyre and go, telepathy scene. Hey, that's a fantastical trope. Jane Eyre fantasy. That
Mhm.
is completely reasonable for me to articulate about my experience of reading Jane Eyre. It does enormous violence to Jane Eyre's experience, right? Because
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
not
yeah.
what that actually is a religious scene. That's actually a miracle. It's very
It's a
clear in Jane Eyre
miracle.
that
Well,
what's
yeah.
happening is that is God
Hmm.
taking action in the world, bringing these two lovers together who are destined to be together. It is absolutely not any kind of rupture. There is no sense. Shaban lives in our century, and there's a lot of times he's being coy, where he's like, literature, ooh, fantasy, ooh, literature. For Jane Eyre, I am convinced this was a seamless world in
Okay,
which.
but that's mm, yes,
So
I
it's us
agree.
bringing the fantasy versus realism is totally a conversation we're having. It would be it's Jane Eyre. That's not
But
that's not
I wouldn't say that's, I mean, so I wouldn't call that a science fiction text. I would have said it's a gothic slash magical realist text because the
But
that's how
also magical
magical.
realist is not her. Well, okay,
No,
in
it
the
is.
sense
Like
that it's
that's what magical realism, the way I would define magical realism is a a sort of a base assumption that there is a supernatural layer to the world, right? That we can at times access. And it's there and it's present and it manifests and it has its own logic. Sometimes it is explicitly religious, sometimes it is not. But that's kind of like fundamentally it is. Farah Mendelssohn, in her Rhetorics of Fantasy, she goes through and talks about different types of fantasy. She talks about
yeah.
portal
I've
fantasy
read it.
versus
Yeah,
blah blah
yeah.
blah. Okay, good.
I like
So
it.
yeah, so I know, but our listeners have not, right? So
Mm.
and so when I'm explaining this to my students, I often use the unicorn in the garden as an example of this, right? Because if a unicorn appears in your garden in a fantasy, it's generally treated as an interruption, right? And you have to deal with that as a, why is there a fantastical interruption in the world? How could a unicorn
Right,
suddenly appear in the
right,
garden? You have to interrogate it and deal with it. And that's part of what can slow down the writing of a text like that, because if you don't do that, the reader is going to have trouble suspending disbelief. What's fabulous about magical realism from that point of view is it's not an interruption. When the unicorn appears in the garden, it is just part of the supernatural layer to the world. You might be surprised because it hasn't happened before, but it doesn't require you to rethink your entire framework of the universe, right?
let me I know what you're saying, and I think I mean in a way the dumbest kind of academic argument is us quibbling about words. So I'm always happy to adopt the term you want to
Yeah,
you want to use, right? So and but I think you can use these words um broadly or narrowly, right? So
hmm
sure, totally. Magical realism is it. One of the things about magical realism is that it refutes the sort of narrow notion of a mechanistic world in which magic is banished from. It reintroduces magic into the world. And so in that way, sure, Jane Eyre and the Torah and the Ramayana
hmm
would all be magical realism. Like that's a very broad
hmm
version of magical realism. However,
Yeah,
allow me to make a brief digression because
sure.
I
Yeah.
just love this analogy. So Orthodox Jews are newer than Reformed Jews. Okay. Everybody, you
Okay.
think that Orthodox Jews are the old traditional kind of Jew. No, no. Orthodox Jews are newer. First, there were Jews, then there were Reformed Jews, and then there were Orthodox Jews. Orthodoxy is a
Mhm.
response to modernity. You don't have orthodoxy before you have modernity. Before anyone is
Right.
challenging, you didn't have reform.
Right.
Pre-reform Jews or whatever, pre-reform, there were apocorsim. There were people who were atheists or defiant or heretics or whatever, saying some crazy thing. But there was no programmatic like attempt to replace the worldview that God was in the center with a worldview that of like a naturalistic, mechanistic world. So nobody had to be Orthodox. The first Orthodox synagogues happened because in the 1850s in Germany, all these synagogues started modernizing and putting in organs and having the men sit with the women and changing the way they dressed and moving Shabbos to Sunday, and they did all and then a bunch of people were like, "This is crazy. We want to go back to the old ways. We want to restore the old ways," and then they founded Orthodoxy, right?
Mhm.
So, and in a similar way, sure, on some level, broadly defined, you could say Jane Eyre is magical realist, but there's a difference between being before and being after, because when Garcia Marquez or when 20th century Latin American magical realists or Rushdie are doing this, they know that there's a worldview in which, I mean, and possibly Bronte does too, because sure, I mean, maybe she's refuting Austen, but there's a difference between being just like, well, of course the world has ghosts, and being like, fuck you, the world has ghosts. Like, and there's a way in which magical realism, as practiced today, is definitely like already knows that this is a debate and is taking a position in it,
Yeah.
versus
So
just
this is
like,
this is where I want to kind of tag in Sylvia Moreno Garcia. We did an
mhm.
interview with her for the SLF and spent a while talking about her work and the sort of where it fits into contemporary fantasy. And I I don't know, like I don't disagree with you. I think that the question of sort of like what is if your default culturally, if the entire culture's default is that magic exists, then you write stories in which magic exists.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that is different than um, if you live in a mechanistic universe generally as your base assumption. Although I kind of want to poke at that, right? Because I'm not sure that.
Well, or if it's contested, if you live in a community where both things are
But is it
present,
that
both
but I guess what I'm
worldviews
saying
are
is,
present.
like, was it ever really not contested? Like, I can't go back 1,000 years and talk to people who were religious back then,
I mean, I think it
but
was definitely, go on, but I
but
mean, I
my
feel
my
I feel
sense is
strongly that it was.
but my sense back then is that it was contested back then too, right? That even if it was a default, even if there were, like, very strong cultural assumptions about there is a god, the gods do this, etc., so on. The fae will come and bring will take away your children, whatever. It doesn't have to be a Christian type god, but there were people back then arguing about it. I would
Well, of
I
course.
would
I mean,
think,
no.
right?
Let
And
me put,
so,
like, everything is always contested. There has never been a unified notion. No group of humans has ever like had a unified cultural like agreement on almost. You know, right? I mean, but
right.
who are the candidate? Which are your candidate philosophies has varied a lot, right? And which
Hmm.
ones seem reasonable? And I mean, so the deal with religion and science, I think, is best summed up by Civilization 4, right? The computer game, in which monasteries give you research up until like the scientific method. So they're actually really good. If you want to get like really good science, you
Yeah,
should
yeah,
build a
yeah.
lot of monasteries because you get lots of science out of monasteries. They pray and do science. That's like they want to find out how God's world works, so they do a lot of science. Like, it's not. And then once you get to the scientific method, there's a certain point at which monasteries and temples are no longer good for generating research. They're good for like making all your people happy. Like, if you have lots of
Hmm.
different kind in the latest period, if you're in like the contemporary period in Civilization 4, if you have lots of different religious temples of different kinds, it makes your people happy. Like, it's shifted. What they're
Hmm.
for has shifted. And I think that's just a very eloquent way of talking about it. People tend to anachronistically talk about some clash between religion and science as if that was a thing in the 12th century. All the scientists were religious in the 12th century. In fact, the probably atheists would have to be an atheist in the 12th century was to say there is no order and reason to the world. I refute the entire notion of a cosmic order. Like, this is all random bullshit. So you'd be the least scientific person, right?
Sure.
Maimonides, and it's interesting because if you look at Maimonides, I mean, of course there was an argument about which sorts of things And Maimonides talks about he's familiar with the Greeks, and he knows that Aristotle thought that the world was is eternal, and he
Mhm.
says, and he believes that there was a creator, like a moment of creation, and that things follow from that. And he says, if I was presented with irrefutable proof that the world was eternal, I would be forced to adopt that. Like obviously, reason trumps revelation. Like if it was
Mhm.
proved to me, but there wasn't anything around for him. There was no Darwin. There wasn't this body of, it wasn't just that there wasn't an accumulation of evidence. There wasn't a coherent worldview. If you said, well, then why are there people? Did we grow out of rocks? Like what, how did
So wait,
people
so
get
where are
here?
you how are you marking a coherent worldview? Like, I mean, I assume you're not talking about the emergence of the scientific method, right? So
Well, I think it's a line that goes from Newton to Darwin. Somewhere along the lines between Newton and Darwin, you have an accumulation of an entire different account of how complexity arises, where you actually could believe that a blind watchmaker, like that a random series of dominoes banging into each other could give rise to like people writing poetry. That is a very weird idea, right? The idea that there
Mhm.
could just be random fluctuations of randomness and just little billiard balls bumping into each other, and then accidentally we get Hamlet, right? Like
Mhm.
that, and unless you have the notion of natural laws and complexity arising and evolution, like even by Darwin, you just sort of have an inkling of that. But
Mhm.
like people begin to get, and that's exactly when uh, you bef- in a certain point in history,
That's a
it's
lot of
not
weight to
that.
it feels like a lot of weight to put on Darwin. I'm like I don't know enough about, what was happening in like Arabic philosophy or, you know, the the Indian text or African text or you know what I mean? Like I can see that for like I can see the argument you're making for like European understandings of this, but I'm like, was it really
I'm not saying there were two. I'm not saying the world was a benighted mass of all one thing, and then the great Western science arose.
right? That doesn't
I
seem
don't think
like
I'm
your sort of
putting.
argument. Yeah.
No, no, I'm no. I'm just saying this is like thing. These are things P and Q. Like there was thing A, and then there was thing B, and then there was thing C, and like the clash between before and after Lao Tse, or before and after Plato and Socrates, or
Mhm.
before and after I mean monotheism. Like that was the invention of monotheism, another big sort of shift, right? And there's a
Mhm.
period where monotheism in various places there's like a border between not monotheism is the wrong word. It was monotheism in the West, but the like high religions that allowed you to organize a polity around like we should all like there is a unified. There can be proclamations from the temple steps about what we should. Well, I'm not sure that's the right. Anyway, my point is there's a bunch of different shifts, right? This is not
Yeah.
Darwin is not.
No, no. So I will give you lots
But
of different shifts. I'm a little like
But
unconvinced
but
still
we
about.
are
Yeah.
narrowly focused on this one. I mean, but no, but when
Yeah.
we say, oh, the Torah is magical realism, we're kind of conflating all of those other shifts. We're not noticing that the difference between Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine is vast. We're sort of putting them
Right.
all in one category, and we're sort of saying, well, weren't there always people who thought what Darwin thought? No, like there weren't always people who thought what you know what what Shankara thought either, right? I mean, there was, I mean, like there are
Mhm.
lots of big fundamental shifts of new ideas, and they catch on, and people a preponderance of evidence arises, and people are like, oh, this is reasonable thinking people go like, oh, this is probably it for any. And at any given time, there's two or three things that could be it, but like, you know what I mean? And I just
Yeah,
think
yeah, no. So, but let me drag you back to. I think I'm with you. I think that makes sense to me. But to drag you back to the text and the genre question, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, genre as marketing category. I think we can exist. We can accept that's a thing. Put it
Mhm.
aside. I'm not really so interested in like
Sure.
we're creating chiclets so that we can sell it to this particular demographic. Blah blah blah. Right.
Mhm.
But I
I mean, there's
I
an
still
interesting.
feel I still feel like there's the question that interests me more
Mhm.
is when I write a story, I I do kind of make a decision about which framework I'm going to be playing in, right? That the
Mhm.
story is going to be, you know, a realist story with a supernatural layer to it, or it's going to be, you know, deeply embedded in the heart of sword and sorcery fantasy, or do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
um,
Of course, yeah, I definitely know what you mean. But I think that but I wouldn't. Yeah, but what you're doing there is you're invoking you're using certain signals to evoke certain sets of reader expectations and
yes.
reader and not just reader expectations, you are you are advertising certain sources of reader pleasure. Because I actually think that pleasure is at the heart of genre. I think that real and see when people talk about science fiction and fantasy, they're like, well, it's got to have three of these and four of those. When people talk about horror, they understand like horror writers don't think that like if you have if you have two chainsaws in a story that makes it horror.
Hmm.
They think of horror as a feeling. It's horror if it feels
Right,
like
right.
horror. It's horror if it scares you. And if it's gross out horror or if it's creepy horror, those are all like and I think that's the right way to think about it, is the way romance and horror writers think about it or comedy
So I
writers, which is this does this for me.
So I would pause there, because I
Yes.
think that there are different types of genre, and I typically will say horror and erotica I would define as genres of mood. The
Yeah.
if erotica is not arousing, not to everybody, but to somebody, it has failed. Like, that is definitionally the goal of erotica, is to arouse. And
Hmm.
similarly, definitionally, the goal of horror is to horrify in some sense, right? And Poe, I
Sure.
think when you look at what he was doing, um, and he writes about what he's trying to do a lot with language, and he's trying to evoke a mood and
Hmm.
create that sense.
Hmm.
I would say that fantasy, for example, doesn't is not a genre of mood. There's no specific definitional mood you evoke with fantasy or with science fiction. Romance is also a different type of genre from A, erotica horror, B, fantasy science fiction, in that romance is about a an arc, and like, there's a reason why you have this terminology about the happily ever after, um, and the sort of need for that as a requirement. It must end with the happy ending, and not that there aren't texts that play with that or invert it, and are still sort of within the romance framework, but they're like that framework and that arc, and and generally I would add to that, even I haven't studied romance deeply, but I think the idea that the protagonists have both exterior and internal obstacles to overcome, that they have to overcome before they earn their happily ever after. All of that to me seems very central to, the definitional category of romance as a genre. And so, like, I think already you're seeing three different types of genre. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes
Um,
sense, but here's the thing I would say is you're a scholar. So you're partly coming to this from like, I mean, and what I'm saying is partly polemical, right? I mean, I'm speaking as a practitioner and as a student of it, I was paying attention to it, but I'm not saying that I would necessarily, if I had a class of students who had to, who were going to go on to the next class and had to reproduce what romance was, that I would tell them that this is. I don't think what I'm saying is a consensus view. What I'm saying is I think that science fiction and fantasy, at least, I can't really speak to romance uh, as a practitioner. I think science fiction and fantasy are in denial of the fact of how much mood is important and how much it's actually about reader pleasure. So I mean, I don't know very much about romance, but I would say that if you look at it from the outside definitionally, you're like, well, it has to have a happy ever after, and it has to have and the overcoming of external. And if you're an impartial scholar who's looking at it, it makes sense to say, oh, these are the aspects we would categorize this in the romance bucket because of. If you're looking at some text that you've discovered, you're like, well, is it romance? You could say, well, it has these aspects, so we can categorize it. But what I'm saying is that for a romance reader, I think you could. I think if I was a romance author, I would be immediately tempted to try to find something that broke the mold that romance readers would nonetheless accept. And I suspect that if romance readers don't get a happily ever after, usually when people try to fool around with the genre, they don't. Then they're mad because they wanted the happy ever after, but they didn't want it because it fit into a definitional rubric that they had learned. They want it because of the way that it makes them feel to get a happily ever after. And if you manage to make them feel that way in a different way, they'd be like, "This is the bomb." And in science
they might
fiction,
like the book, but it might not be romance at that point,
but it
right?
might not
Like,
be romance for a scholar. But if the romance readers were flocking to buy it, and I'm not just talking about marketing category, if the romance readers were engaging with it, Forget about the money. If romance readers were engaging with it and were like, this is the best thing, do you know what
No,
I
but
mean?
then
Like, I don't.
no, I don't think so, Ben. Because I look, then all you have, let's say you create this other thing, and someone else figures out how to do it, and now you have 20,000 of them, and all the romance readers love it. I still don't think that makes it romance. It makes it another thing
Strangers,
that gives you the same pleasure that romance gives you, but it doesn't make it the same thing.
I,
It's just
I
another
think
thing,
his, I
right? Just
think
like
historically,
sense of wonder is something that I would say is characteristic of science fiction and fantasy, but just because both of them have sense of wonder doesn't make the genres the same,
they have
right?
different kinds
So
of sense of wonder. They have different kinds of sense of wonder. And wait, let me, Strangers on a Train.
I don't know
Okay.
what are you
Patricia
referencing?
Highsmith, Strangers on a Train. So it's
I have
1940s, and well,
okay,
so mystery readers, right? There were mystery readers,
okay,
and mystery readers read books about detectives solving cases. Detectives were they were the protagonists, and the criminals were the bad guys. They were the antagonists. And Strangers on a Train is I think, I'm not a student, I'm not a scholarly historian of mystery, but my understanding is one of the first ones where it was like, this book is entirely going to be from the mind of the criminal. Like, she inverted the whole thing and made the criminal
sure,
the and you could say, well, that wasn't mystery anymore, and arguably maybe not. But actually, what happened is that we don't call it mystery, we call it crime fiction because of Strangers on a Train. Like, what actually happens in the real world is that if somebody pulls it off of delivering the pleasure, then at the very least, it would what actually probably would happen was it would fracture, right? You have a community of people organized around
hmm
something, and my point is that the anthropologists from the outside would come and apply some definitional framework, but the people aren't operating from a definitional framework. They're excited about a thing and engaged in something, in a conversation, because of things they care about. And if you deliver the same goods in a different way, what it probably does is fracture the community. Now you have cozy mysteries and two-fisted mysteries and crime fiction more generally and police procedurals. And the way that happened is that somebody said, oh, I can do this a different way, and then it
sure.
worked. So it's not
Okay,
like it's not like it's
lost
a
track. I've lost
box.
track of what
Yeah.
you were trying to argue that was different from what I was trying to argue, but I still feel
I
like
guess
I don't.
I think the core of genre is reader pleasure. I think it's obvious in horror because everybody says it. I think in science fiction, people say no, science fiction is about this and that and the other thing. But I think actually that probably there's more than one kind of science fiction.
Sure.
But a lot of what's going on in science fiction is actually, I think that the science fiction community's consensus arguments about what makes science fiction are bogus. And the example I would bring is Life of Brian. If you take, or for instance, if you take their arguments at face value, completely earnestly and seriously, Life of Brian is science fiction. And I think that's nonsense. I think it's nonsense to regard
Yeah,
it as science
no,
fiction
that's. I mean,
because
I
it
would
doesn't
agree that
deliver
it's
what a science
nonsense,
fiction
but I
reader
don't.
wants.
Yeah, but I don't. I still think you're reaching too far by saying that like science fiction is a genre of mood. I think.
Well,
I
I'm
mean,
not. That was your terminology. I'm not saying it's. I didn't say it's a genre of mood. I didn't say it's a genre of mood. What I
okay.
said is it's organized around particular kinds of reader pleasure. That's different. I'm not saying
Yeah.
if you already have a category of there are genres of mood and not genres of mood, then sure, science fiction would go in the not genres of mood bucket if those are the two buckets. But what I'm saying is people like to tell themselves stories about what definitionally incorporates the genre, but if you look at their behavior, that's not actually what they care about. Nobody goes and says, well, I'm looking for a book today that, or I want to read a book that, like, contains counterfactual statements. Nobody says that. People are like, I want this to make me think, oh my god, that could happen, which is a different thing, that it contains counterfactual statements.
I'm not sure what okay, counterfactual statements is your shorthand for magic, or I'm not
No,
understanding
I'm
what you're
saying when
saying
people
here.
usually the definitional arguments that I usually hear, the sort of traditional, when
Yeah.
people say, well, what is science fiction and fantasy? They're like, well, fantasy is things that could not happen. And also it probably has magic, which always confuses me because magic is like a 1 millionth of 1% of the things that could happen. Like, just
hmm
that's an interesting way of looking at the problem. Magic. What does magic have to do with fantasy? Like, clearly magic has something to do with fantasy, but not
hmm
definitionally. Like, definitionally, if you just had blobs of goo that, like, spawned blue turtles that gave off rainbows, that would be fantasy. And there's not any I mean, I guess you could just assert that they're magic blue turtles, But usually when we talk about magic, we mean some way in which somebody volitionally is controlling or evoking, or like they're doing something that makes magic things happen.
Maybe. I mean, now you're getting back to the magical realism thing, right? And this distinction, right? In the magical realist text, there's not necessarily any volition, right? If you look at something like Water for Chocolate, it's never volitional. It's just that she's brokenhearted and she's crying into the soup, and when she serves the soup, everyone else cries, right? And
Yeah.
that's,
Oh, yeah. And I would
there's
say that that's, but don't you think that that makes it more magical realism and less fantasy? Like,
yes, yes. So
and why? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I
So,
mean,
so,
what is?
so if I was going to make a distinction, right? I mean, maybe one. I mean, I really feel like I should have reread Farah's book about this before we had this conversation. It's been a little while, but I mean, the fantasy, I would say, does in fact rely sort of on a mechanistic understanding of the world, a scientific, rational understanding of the world, in which magic is an interruption, and then. Um, Not necessarily volitional. I think volitional is only a component, right? Like, I
But
think
when you
that's
say
a
it, when you say it relies, I mean, you're talking. I mean, in intrusion fantasies or portal fantasies, that's true. But presumably, you think Lord of the Rings is fantasy, right? And in Lord of the Rings, there's no mechanistic world
right
on the
secondary
page that's
world,
being interrupted.
secondary world fantasy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
So,
so what you're saying is you mean in the mind of C.S. Lewis and his readers, the distinction
hmm
between this secondary they the the missing thing that's not on the
yeah,
page but
yeah.
in the reader's mind is the contrast between their mechanistic world and this magical secondary world. Is that what you're saying? I mean,
Yes, I think so. I mean, I hadn't thought this out before we started talking about it, but I think so, right? Like, this is you're talking about a source of reader pleasure, right? Like, in Lord of the Rings, it gives me pleasure that there are Ents, right? And part
yeah.
of what gives me pleasure is that I do not know of any Ents in our world, and I wish there were, right? So,
Right, right.
so I
But the
mean,
wish there
I'm still
were is
hoping there are somewhere in the deep forest that I don't know about, like that would be great.
but the wish, the
So,
yearning, the wish there were. That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the that we could observe, oh, there aren't any ents, and therefore, well, let me ask you: if there was an ent, if an ent was found, would it?
mhm.
How to what degree would that dim your enjoyment of Lord of the Rings?
I think it would change it to a different sort of pleasure, right? Right? Like, it would be awesome if we found ants, just like, like when they discover, a new sea creature at the bottom of the ocean that's
Yeah.
deeper than we've gone before, and it looks like, something out of a fantasy novel. That is fabulous. That's very exciting and delightful. Um, but it is a different kind of pleasure than imagining something that, as far as we know, does not exist, has never existed, possibly could not exist, such as fire breathing dragons, right? Which are very scientifically difficult, right? To make the classic Western dragon able to fly and breathe fire, right?
Well, I mean, of course,
So,
you're describing Pern, like the science fictionization of dragons, but
yeah.
but but I mean, I guess what I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much there is in this, but I guess it's because I mean maybe it comes to the same thing and we're just phrasing things differently. But I think that it's like what I like every once in a while, every few years, the awards get in trouble, right? Every few years, there's a story like the women. There was the whole what was there was a story, an homage to Tiptree's story, The Women Men Don't See. What I Didn't See,
Mhm.
right? Karen J. Fowler wrote What I
Mhm.
Didn't See. And it won a Hugo or something, and everybody, or a Nebula, and everybody there was sort of an old guard that was up in arms saying, like, that's not science fiction because it don't have anything in it that was science fictional, like,
Yeah, and
in that
we
sort
got
of
into this. We got into
definitional
this.
ingredienty.
Yeah, and
And
I think
that,
there was the Green Glass Sea
yeah, the Green Glass Sea.
by
Right,
I'm
exactly.
sorry, Ellen Klages,
Alan
which
Klage's Green Glass Sea,
published in
right?
Strange Horizons, if I'm remembering all this right. And again, it's like it's sciency. It's not necessarily science fiction, right? I mean, it's
It's
not science
fiction about
fiction, right?
science, but it
Right. It's
doesn't it
fiction about
doesn't fit
science.
some kind of definitional logical, like, oh, it doesn't have ingredient one and ingredient two.
Yeah,
And
it's a
but I
great
don't
story. But
but
yes.
but but that's the thing where that's not that there are some people who are talking about those definitions, but it feels to me secondary. It feels to me that what I care about when I'm and it what the reason it's relevant as a writer is precisely what you said. When you sit down to write, you're like, how will I
Mhm.
reach these readers? How will I need to I need it will be different if I write this story about a bug and the
Mhm.
readers read it in that same essay. We're sort of circling about around Delaney's essay this whole conversation, but in that same essay he talks about how if you read a story about somebody who wakes up and is a bug,
Mhm.
and you read it with like in an ace paperback with a rocket on the cover, and and this and that, you if the extra textual clues tell you that it is genre science fiction, then you have one set of questions. And if you read it in like a leather embossed modern classics of the 20th century edition,
Yeah.
then you have a different set of questions, right? You're like,
No,
what
and
does it
I've
represent
I've I've
versus
written
like,
stories that, were published as mainstream lit and published as erotica, and which is always interesting to me, right? Because
mm-hmm,
I think there's this question of like, well, how does the reader encounter the story differently
yeah,
with those expectations, right? Like if they open an erotic, and there's a really concrete difference, right? Which is if you read this story, like Seven Cups of Water is the one I'm thinking of, right? If you read it in an erotica anthology, one of the problems with an erotica anthology, generally, as someone who's edited them, is that um, like a romance, it's hard to maintain suspense because you know what the ending is, right?
yeah.
Like there's a certain like there's an arc. There's an
uh-huh.
arc leading to arousal to climax, etc. And there are
Mm,
occasional stories that subvert that, but that's going to be like an anthology of 20 stories. The
yeah.
bulk of them are going to follow that arc. And then the question is mostly like, well, if the reader knows that, how are you going to make it interesting anyway, right? And
Mm-hmm,
that's an interesting project, but if someone read Seven Cups of Water in my mainstream collection, they would
mm-hmm.
not go in
They
with
don't know
that
that they're gonna right. They
expectation.
don't know if they're gonna hook up
Right,
or not. It's
right.
wide open.
So
Right.
it completely changes the story, right? It changes the
Right.
reading of it
Right.
from moment to moment. So,
Exactly. Like the reader's expectations are crucial because the reader is writing half the story. So when
mhm,
you think about genre, when you're sitting down to write something and thinking about genre, what you're trying to do is marshal sets of reader expectations and sort of implicit contracts with the reader, right?
mhm,
And a lot of times in revision, when they're like, I don't know, this was unsatisfying, it kicked me out or whatever. When you take these take critiques of where the story didn't work, you often, you know, they didn't like what happened on page 27. They're vehemently hated what page 27. What you end up finding in revision is you don't need to change page 27. You just change page 5, right?
right.
Because the reason they hate page 27 so much is that on
It
page
wasn't set up
5
properly. Yeah,
they absorbed some kind of promise about what
yeah.
they were going to get, and
Mhm,
so that and they you can fulfill the promise, you can delightfully subvert the promise, but you have made some kind of signal about what this is going to be, both extra
mhm,
textually because it's published in an erotic anthology or a mainstream anthology, but also in the way the story works, right? Like in the
yeah,
signals you send. But I think that, so I guess something about that excitement that I have about how do you engage with the reader and lead them different places, and how are they going to read this story? I feel a certain frustration with what I think is a kind of, I don't know if it's exactly academic, but like in the case of a story like What I Didn't See or Green Glass Sea, there is kind of um, a protest, which often in those contexts is kind of gatekeepery, maybe. But there's a protest against, well, that doesn't count. That's not on this side of the line. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to say, I don't like this. This isn't getting
sure,
me what I want.
right,
I think
right.
it's perfectly legitimate for I mean, I don't know, for people to be like nostalgic for the fiction of their youth and be like, why aren't there more, I don't know, like rational people solving problems in space or something? And but
Mighty Dude men and women hurling themselves at them, right? So,
well, that's often between the lines, right?
yeah,
But
I can understand that, or
yeah, I mean, if that's
brilliant
your
scientists
thing,
and women hurling themselves at them. So either way, but
I guess it's actually, I mean, I guess in
I mean,
some
that
sense
is a
it's
little
actually,
problematic, though, right? Like, I mean, there because it's not
well,
just like I take pleasure in this. The pleasure comes with a set of loaded, you know, s-
right. Well, this actually
you know,
gets to the heart of. I think this is close to the heart of what I'm saying. If you look at it, because that is interesting, right? So like manly men and women throwing themselves at each other. That's gross, unless you put it in a context where if you read that on like AO3 and it's got like the right tags where it's like capital M little f, like this is
yeah,
that by making it kink. instead of norm. Like if you're like, this is the normative thing, women should throw themselves at men, that fucking sucks. If you're like, this is a kink, once you acknowledge this is a kink, you're like, it's one of many kinks, right? Now, it still is a kink that's like been historically forced down our throats, right? But like, you at
Yeah,
least take a step away from that. You take a step away from its enthroning if you
yeah.
say, this is just my jam. And I guess
So I
that's
want to
part of what, yeah, go ahead.
I want to like bracket that a little bit
Yeah.
because like Pat Califia
Uh-huh.
recently wrote on his Facebook wall a whole long thing about this, and as someone who was sort of in the midst of the community
Mm-hmm.
and helped define the community for a long time, I think this is still under debate, right? Like in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that there are a lot of people who are, for example, really not okay with race play in
Mm-hmm.
S&M situations, and there are going to be like this is the
I
so
mean, you
I,
you
I
mean really not okay with anyone doing it, even if they're not there. Like really not
exactly
okay with
right,
it
really
existing.
not
Yeah.
okay with it existing, and I think I'm not saying that I am I just want to acknowledge, I guess, that like where you and I fall on this may not be where A, we may not fall in the same place, but B, it may not be where a lot of our listeners fall, right? Like there's going to be
Sure. I
a
hear you.
whole host of people who say like, and this is whether you're the person who thinks that we should not have violence in video games because you think it creates violence in the community,
Uh-huh.
or the person who thinks, well, we should not no one should read pedophilic material because it's going to incite actual pedophilia or like there's a whole conversation to be had that I
Mhm.
think is
Sure.
like I think that's almost it's its own podcast, right? Like a whole
Yeah.
conversation about sorry
No, no,
it's like
I know
I
exactly
want to like
what you're saying.
I want to like mark and bracket and put it
Yeah, yeah.
aside and say like that's we're not engaging with the ethical issues here really at
Well,
the moment. Like we're not going deep into them, right? Like or because I don't
I
have
mean,
time to go deep into it
no,
today
I
because I
understand what
think
you're
it's a big conversation. But
I
um,
allow me to respond.
yeah,
I'm just saying I'm
yeah,
just
go
look,
ahead.
I am not a hardcore I do not I am not like a hardcore free speech liberal about this. I think I think that are stories that can be bad for people. And maybe there are stories that like people should stop writing and reading. Sure. Like definitely.
I mean,
You know, no,
I'm not sure I would say that. I may be a hardcore free
I don't.
speech liberal, but
Well, we
that's
could
sort of what
find
I
out.
mean.
But I mean, that could be a separate thing. But I do not wish to present. I'm not trying to present the position of like, oh, if you label it, everything is okay. No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that whether it's still bad or not, or worse or whatever, just the act of dethroning by itself,
Yeah,
irrespective of whether it's then okay, like it still might not be okay.
right.
But the act of dethroning it from
Yes,
being
and
the central norm
marking it as not the norm. Yeah, no, I
and
think that does.
saying it's like
Yeah.
this is somebody's thing, it takes an enormous step towards allowing there to be a proliferation of things. And that is close to this itch I have about genre and about saying, well, science fiction is thus and so, as
Hmm.
opposed to saying, I like thus and so. The
Hmm.
nice thing about centering all genres, not just official ones of mood, as in sources of reader pleasure, it's that we're now not talking about what is right and proper and just science fiction. We're talking
Hmm.
about what we get
Right,
into,
and
what
no,
we're
and I'm
into.
not. Yeah, and I'm not so
Yeah,
interested really in the definitional aspects, right? I mean, I'm not.
yeah,
Thankfully, I'm not a critic. I, and I don't have to stake out a position there on any of that. But um, I have some academic training, but I'm not an academic in that sense. But I guess where we started, I'm going to see if I can loop it back to where we started, is I guess where I think it's the interest is figuring out what game you're playing, right? And I think the text
hmm
does like decide to engage in a certain game and then trying to do that well and trying to signal it to the reader effectively so the reader kind of
hmm
engages with it appropriately, and then of course you have people like Nabokov or whomever who are live to mess with that, but for the most part I think that's how writers how I don't think it's unfair to put text in a genre. I think it's really just sort of saying like this story has been told in a manner to play a certain game, right, with the reader. I think
yeah.
that's all I
But
was trying to say at the beginning.
no,
So
I'm very, I totally agree with you, and I'm very I like that, right? I like that playing, I
Mhm.
like doing that. I like that moment when you're sitting down to write a story and you're like, what will this do? But I also feel protective of the little, students who are arriving and being handed down the tablets. I mean, it's kind of like and we could talk sometime about the Turkey City lexicon. I mean, it's sort of like I have an
Yeah,
antipathy to like lots of the 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 handed down truths, right?
sure.
Precisely because that game's important, precisely because it's important to be like, oh, how am I going to engage with the reader? And what I'm saying is, I feel like the model of like that there are genres, and you are either in one or maybe at the border of one or maybe subverting one with another, but like basically, it's like chocolate and vanilla. That
So I do go ahead,
that
finish.
well, I, that seems to me that is unnecessarily limiting people in the moment where they are doing this important work, which is not to say, I'm not saying, oh, just, let the muse speak and it's all one. No, no, no. Genres are really important. Genres are really crucial. But thinking about it like this partakes of these genres, making these moves, or is evoking these tropes, is different than saying, I'm going to write an X and therefore it must follow the rules of X. You know what I'm
So
saying?
let me yeah, no, I do, but I'm gonna take this to people's love lives, and I think I can
Okay.
make a useful analogy here
Nice.
because, um, so I'm not monogamous. I'm poly. Uh, I've been with Kevin for 28 years, and we live together. We have two kids. We got married some years ago, mostly for medical legal reasons. But we are long term committed, etc. Um, I also have another long-term partner, Jed, who I've been with for 22 years, something like that, and various others. Um, so the I'm framing this for readers who may not know about my life. Everyone knows about everybody else. It's all open. I used to host poly support groups. And one thing that you saw a lot in those groups was a distinction between, like a division between the people who approached it very definitionally
Mhm.
and those who didn't. And
Uh-huh.
so the definitionally, I guess I mean sort of like the people who wanted a lot of rules, right?
Uh-huh.
They were happiest, most comfortable approaching opening up their relationships if they could say rules like if they could make agreements like we're not going to um, go to a new movie with somebody
Mhm.
else because we're pair bonded and new movies are super important to me that I see it with you. Or this is our restaurant. We don't take anyone else there. This is our bed. We don't have sex with other people in our bed. Um, if you are off at a conference and you meet somebody, you have to call me and let me know before anything happens, is a sort of classic one.
Uh-huh.
And um, and you could kind of say, and then there are the people who are like me, who are more, um, you know, we'll talk about it afterwards, and just be sure you keep me informed in a reasonable manner, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is you can make the argument that both styles are valid, right? Um, but I do think that the rules following style, even though some people prefer it, seems more brittle a lot of the time,
Hmm.
um, and it is a little more prone to people crossing a boundary and then
Mm.
having to fix it, right?
Mhm.
And so and it sometimes it's ends up spawning a tremendous number of rules. And I think it's, like that's how some
Yeah.
people end up. And it to me
Yeah.
that reminds me of like when Judd was editing Strange Horizons, right? And like
Yeah.
the fiction editors would put out lists of like stories we've seen too often,
Right, right,
stories we
right. No
don't want to see
zombies,
before.
no.
Right,
Yeah.
and the list just got longer and longer and longer and
Yeah.
longer, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I was no longer running the magazine at that point, and I thought they did a great job generally, but I always thought looking at that list that is, like, I understand the impulse that leads to you saying, like, "Please don't send me another Adam and Eve story,"
Yeah.
but, um, I kind of think it's the wrong approach, right?
Hmm.
Like those lists just make people want to break the rules, and like
Uh-huh.
that's fundamental. Like if you give someone a rule, like
Sure.
I cannot go to a movie with this other person,
Huh.
and there's a sort of basic human instinct to break the rule, right? So you're kind of asking to trigger that. So there's,
That's
because
really
I'm
funny. I mean, that's really funny that you say that because I was like totally. It's I like the analogy, and I'm glad you're bringing it.
yeah, yeah.
But it's very funny that my reaction to the Adam and Eve rule is it's like my immediately gut like hindbrain reaction is like now I must write the Adam and Eve story that will convince you, Jed. But my reaction to like don't go to when you're like of course you want to go to the movie with that person. My like a hindbrain reaction is no I fucking don't. Like oh my god. But that may be why I'm not Polly. Anyway.
Well, but I would say that this is I would say this is an issue in monogamous marriages too, right? Like I think, this may not tempt you, but I would, like generally I think people who are monogamous have this fundamental rule of we're not going to sleep with anybody else. And I think that leads to, you know, I'm mad at my spouse, right? Like, he didn't put the toilet seat down again.
you
It's
think
one in
that
a
you think
long chain of things that no, it
that's
is
the
like
rule that
it's
leads to it? I mean, that's what leads
I
to it?
think it's I think relationships can be very brittle. And I think you can be going along thinking everything's fine, but in fact there has been an accumulation of little injuries.
Oh yes,
And
definitely. I mean, I'm
right?
definitely
And
right
so
there with you. But I don't know. But I don't
and
know.
so that and so then it doesn't matter what the little thing is that tips you over, right? Something, it could be the toilet seat, it could be the toilet seat. Not putting the toilet seat down is like it works because it is yet another example of lack of consideration, and it leads you to think he's never really loved me. He
Sure.
fundamentally does not, whatever, right? And it confirms you in all your worst feelings about the relationship. And then you're at a convention and this guy is flirting with you and he's like, I would always put the toilet seat down. And you're like, yes, I know you would, So he doesn't actually say that,
Huh.
obviously. But there's something that like they somehow you get the impression that they would not do the thing that your partner has been doing. And I think that's the moment of temptation, right? That's the moment of like, oh, I'd kind of like to break the rule. And so whether you're monogamous or poly almost I think is irrelevant to this. I think what it's really about is, do you approach your relationships, and it's not even just romantic relationships. Like I would say this is true for sibling relationships and parental child relationships and so on. Do you approach it as, here is a set of rules that are put in place for good reasons to protect us from hurting each other, right? Like I totally understand the
Hmm.
impulse to do this, right? Or do you approach it as, we have a fundamental trust and regard for each other, and if you sleep with somebody at a convention, I have faith that you will let me know about it as quickly as is reasonable, as quickly as I need to know, and you don't need my sign off in advance. And that if we do something where we discover that we've hurt each other unintentionally, we will then both take care to not do that again in the future. But it's I don't know, there's a fundamental difference I think between the rules condition and the basic trust net condition. I'm not sure quite what to call it. And so then if you take that back to fiction writing, I think that's sort of something. What I would say to my students is like, the rules are kind of tell you like, well, the editor has seen this kind of story a lot, and odds are if you write this, it's going to piss them off and they're not going to publish it, right? Like it's useful to know what those rules are, sure, saves you some time and energy, but fundamentally, yes, if
Hmm.
you write a great Adam and Eve story, they're going to publish it. Right? Like if you do it in such a
Right.
way that they've never seen
Right.
it before, right? And you know, if I bring home a cat after my husband and I have agreed that we are not getting any more pets, um, but I have fallen madly in love with this cat and I just feel like I have to have it. He loves me and he's probably going to react to that as like, well, I guess we're going to figure out how to fit a cat into our lives, right? Speaking of
Huh.
something that happened last year and it was two cats. But anyway, um, so does that Okay, I know I've been talking a
I
long
mean,
time, so
so
you
no, that
go.
that was really good. So I would say I have three things to say. One is that we're running out of time, right? Like, what
Yes,
didn't
we
you
are. I've
announce we had
gotta
to go a
leave at
while ago?
12, so yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see. So we still have 15 minutes. Okay. Second thing I would say is that I think this. I'm glad you made this analogy, partly because I think this is a really interesting thing for us to talk about, particularly because we
Mhm.
both. I mean, it's we both like to think about relationships a lot, and also we both. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I you. I think you've been with Kevin around the same time that I've been with Esther, so we're
Yeah.
both like in reflecting back on 30 years of the work of
Mhm.
maintaining relationships is very interesting. Um, that's okay. That's two things. I have two more things to say. The other thing I would say is I think you very eloquently made my. I feel like that's exactly. I feel like we ended up on the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
page because that's pretty much what I was saying. Was that
Yeah, yeah, no,
is
I
that
agree. Yeah.
and so yeah, so from the point of view of a practitioner, like from the point of view of somebody observing it, it's one thing to say, well, these here are some rules that are guidelines or whatever, but it's very much depends when you sit, right? The editor is like, I've seen too many of these stories, but the person writing is like you need to give them guidelines. Very often the things you're not supposed to do are like, these are, somebody posted recently something about how they wish they'd known that the rules like show don't tell or this and that are, this is hard. They're not like, don't do this because it makes fiction bad. It's like these are
Mhm.
things that are hard to pull off. Like they are, it is appropriate to see the list of rules as challenges because that's what they are. They're the sort of hoary wisdom of the genre is like, this is the received wisdom about stuff we've seen people screw up a lot. That doesn't mean it's not
Yeah.
worth pursuing. It
There's a
means
there's
it's
a great example of that I just want to give in Le
yeah.
Guin's Steering the Craft. She talks about
Hmm.
this with point of view shifts and signaling point of
Right.
view shifts.
Yep.
Generally, you're going to want to signal it. It takes real skill to pull one off without signaling it. But then she gives a
Hmm.
beautiful example from The Lord of the
Mrs.
Rings.
Dalloway. Oh, Lord of the Rings. Ah,
The
interesting.
Lord of the
Yeah.
Rings. Or also, there may be
Yeah.
one in Mrs. Dalloway too, but the one that always stuck with me is The Lord of the Rings, where
Hmm.
it's a passage where you're watching the hobbits
Yeah.
cross the land, and for a moment you slip into the point of view of a fox, and you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
sentences of the
Right.
fox watching the
Right.
hobbits, and then you just go right back to the narrative, and it's completely smooth. You don't get confused. There's no moment of reader confusion when you're thrown
Hmm.
out of the
Hmm.
text, which is
Right.
always the danger with a point of view
With
shift that
the
isn't
head jumping.
signaled.
Yeah.
But Tolkien has the skill to do it
Right. That's
smoothly.
that's one of those rules. Don't jump heads. And Mrs. Dalloway is like the entire book is
Hmm.
constant jumping from one head to another. And sort of the implicit message of these sort of Turkey-Semitic lexicon. Here's your first 10 rules from Clarion, is often like, well, you're no Virginia Woolf, which is like, well, what if you are gonna be Virginia. Like maybe you shouldn't stop trying hard stuff. You know what I mean? Maybe
Right.
you should. Maybe it's useful to give people a heads up about like this is hard, but it's not a good idea to discourage them from trying hard stuff because that could be great if they could do the hard stuff. Anyway, so um, so yeah about the genres that you have said very eloquently with your analogy. What I was trying to say, um, which is that the ultimate thing that matters is whether you deliver for the reader. And the
Hmm.
rules about what is and is not this genre and what this genre should do and what this genre is allowed to do and so on is all like a convenient superstructure, but not like an act, not the fundamental agreement. Just like in your analogy, in a relationship, the fundamental agreement is like we're going to be here for each other, and the rules
Hmm.
are like epiphenomena. They're like
Hmm.
useful constructs, but they don't. You get in trouble. I think what I hear you saying in the relationship analogy is you get in trouble if you mistake the epiphenomena of the constructs that you think will help do the
Yeah.
thing, if you confuse that with the thing. And that's what
Well,
I was saying. That's what I was
right.
saying about genre is it's great to be like, oh, look what mysteries are revolve around this, or like these are genres of mood or whatever. But like the thing is like the thing the reader is trying to get out of the text, the engagement, the communication, the pleasure that you want the reader to have. So like your rules and definitions are only, they're useful a lot of the time, but they shouldn't be conflated with the actual
Right.
underlying. Yeah.
Yeah, and that and
Um.
they and where that got laid out really well for me in relationship stuff was with The Ethical Slut, which was
Hmm.
one of the very early poly books, kind of talking about how do we do this without hurting people, right? And w- they talk about insecurity and they talk
Yeah.
about jealousy, and specifically like a lot of the time what people are labeling jealousy, like I'm feeling
Yeah.
jealous, and then they try to assuage by putting in rules like don't,
Uh-huh. Right, because
don't
it makes me feel that
don't hug
thing.
this
Yeah.
person because of whatever,
Hmm.
right? They're
Yeah.
saying often that is actually insecurity, right?
Uh-huh.
And that if you can address the insecurity in your own relationship, that often makes the feeling of jealousy basically go away, right? You are then
Uh-huh.
no longer upset by seeing your husband hug his ex-girlfriend when they meet at a party, right? Because you know that the two of you are solid, and this is not actually a threat to, that it doesn't change how he feels about you, etc., so on.
To
Um,
pop out of the so to pop out of the like the relationship conversation is framed by
sure,
analogy and actually engage with the relationship conversation itself.
sure,
So it's interesting to hear you talking about it because in some ways I relate to it a lot, and in some ways it's like completely my experience is very different.
right.
And I sort of think that, and I kind of wanted to poke at some of the things you were saying because you made some kind of bold claim about like, well, the fact that they can't sleep with people and then that's why they get mad about the toilet seat, like so that's that. And I feel like also my perspective is kind of interesting on this because I am I think this is pretty much reasonably true. I mean, I haven't been in that many relationships because I've been in one long 30-year monogamous relationship. Before that, there was not very much data. There was a little data, but not that much. But 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 I am not actually jealous. Like I don't I honestly that and I've had I mean, I have had plenty of occasion to be jealous. I had girlfriends who cheated
Hmm.
on me and whatever. But like, honestly, I do not recall ever really feeling. I recall being upset or irritated or disturbed by that somebody had broken some agreement or something. But I don't have this visceral like bone of being like I can't endure the fact that you're with this other person. I don't have that in my makeup really. Um uh
I think, I mean,
and
mm, I
yeah,
would say, like, I have felt jealousy very rarely.
yeah,
So, um, and so I can also be like 30 years of dating history, maybe, I don't know, a couple, like a double handful of incidents, right, of jealousy.
right.
Um, but that doesn't, but
Well, so what I
I
was going
guess
to
I would
say
say, like,
is
if jealousy is coming out of insecurity a lot of the time, maybe that just says that either you were so secure or you fundamentally didn't care that much,
no,
right?
I cared a lot, but I think in my head, like, I mean, I think, well,
Yeah.
one could psychoanalyze me. I feel like there's a lot to do. I had an odd. I arrived at this game late because I opted out of. Like, I had a very when I was 16 was a very intense year of going from like, I am not interested in. Like I refuse to play these games that I refuse to play this whole post-puberty thing where people like I don't know are romantically or sexually interested in each other. That's absurd, and I refuse. Like I
Mhm.
went from that to like being in a very serious relationship. So it's and I was an alien, you know what I mean? Like I was sort of out. I was a little bit of a pariah as a kid, and I had a long experience of being kind of outside of social norms and like refusing. And so start the clock, which was a story that it was a sort of a we I wrote a story and you wrote a thing in react it was a chain. It was a story that I wrote as part of this sort of exquisite corpse
Oh,
chain
yeah, yeah, yeah.
story game, which you
Right.
wrote a poem in reaction to my story, which I had written in reaction to Diana Sherman's play. But anyway, in
That
that
was
that
Frank Wu's project. Yeah.
yeah, Frank
Yeah.
Lewis Project and Jay Lake or anyway,
Yeah.
I don't remember who was involved, but anyway, the in that story, there's these kids who don't there's this rant by one of these people who's been biologically arrested at the age of 9 for 30 years or something. So they're chronologically 40, but like 9 in terms of how their body
Mhm.
works, and to some extent how their brain works. So they're very smart, but like, and they give this rant about how because their friend because it's now become I'm spoiling it, but it's become possible to start the clock, and their friend wants to
Mhm.
grow and become a mature person. I don't know if the story has aged well,
It's a
but
great story. No, I think so. I bet it has.
well, I'm
I
just
should read
wondering
it
in
again.
terms of like modern, like this was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
2003 or something, and I think public discourse on asexuality and aromanticism had come a long way. So I don't
Oh,
know, it'd
I
be
see.
interesting to read the
Yeah.
story now and be like,
Yeah,
am I
yeah.
making assumptions? It's very influenced by I and Gomorrah. But anyway, yeah, the point I was making is there's this rant where she's like, why the hell would you want to get in this whole like jealousy and romance and this and the possessiveness and this whole crazy like why when we could just go to birthday parties forever, like why, and and fire water guns, why do you want to do this bullshit? And that's definitely my rant, right? That's definitely
Yeah.
me at that age being dragged kicking and screaming into adulthood. Like, and now, and there's a part of me now that's like, why? So I have to say that every time that there was like would be occasion to be jealous, I was just like, what does that have to do with me? Like,
Mm,
like either our relationship is going well or it's not. But like, why are you? You know what I mean? Like, why are you bothering to? Um, like, it didn't seem relevant. It's not that it didn't seem. It's not that it wasn't like I didn't care or it wasn't hurt. It just was like if they didn't like me, that would be very hurtful. If they wanted to go kiss somebody else, I don't understand how that's relevant. Um, which is funny because for somebody who's been practicing for monogamy for 30 years, that's a very naturally poly position, right?
yeah.
However, I also have the experience of being someone with this, in some ways, deficit of not having very much experience, not having a very it's like people have I have a low activation rate of that particular human emotion, right?
Mhm.
And like that actually in some ways is a deficit because am someone who has gotten in a lot of trouble for not understanding that, not by having trouble following rules, because I'm very good at following rules and I've never cheated on anybody, but but by not having sympathy or empathy for how that actually works for people. Like,
Right.
over my life, there's been a whole lot of moments of my having to actually understand that people work differently than I do. I
Mm.
had a funny exchange with my son the other day because my son, I will tell this anecdote briefly because I think it's funny and we should tell more kid stories in our
You
podcast.
should.
My son's uh, um, 16 and he's a great guy. He's very logical and rational. He's an Aspie, out and proud, and uh he was having this he Aviva, my daughter, had to go somewhere, and Noah usually clears the table, and he hates it when people leave their dishes on the. It's his job. It's his chore to clear the table, but everyone's supposed to take their own plate away. And
Mhm.
uh, he was, but if Aviva was in a rush, he was like, "I will clear your plate for you." And I was like, "Wow, that's really nice, Noah. You're being a really nice guy. What a nice guy," I said. And he was like, "Why? Why is that a nice guy?" And I was like, "Because you don't, uh, because I don't know. I tried to explain why he was a nice guy, and he was like, "Well, I would want. Well, I'm simply doing it because I would want someone to do it for me. If I were in a rush, I would want them to clean the paper." I was like, "That's the definition of a nice guy." He was like, "I was simply doing for them what I would want them to do for me," and I was like, "That's the
Right.
definition of a nice guy." He was like, "No." A nice guy is when you do not what you when you do what you would want, but when
Mhm.
you do what they would want. I
Nice.
was like, all right, you have me there. But I thought it was beautifully formulated, and that has been like a great stumbling block in my moral development in a way where it's like it's not actually that hard for me to treat people as I would want to be treated, but it's hard for me to really deeply understand that the way they want to be treated is actually materially different than the way that I would want to be treated. You know what I mean? That there actually is a whole other way of being on the other side of that. So I say this to say that like I was like, oh well, no, jealousy is just you should just think your way out of, but actually, as it turns out, sometimes it's good to be like, oh no, that's actually a third rail. Like we're
Yeah.
not going to do that. Really not. Not because here the structure does meet the thing. Like in fact, like there is not, it's not really like there are definitely things where you, and they could be different things for everybody, but there are definitely things
Right.
where it's like, no, it's not like it's not like the kittens. Sometimes you bring home the kittens and they'd be like, oh, kittens, I guess we'll deal with this. And sometimes they're
Yeah.
like, wow,
No,
that was,
the kittens coulda gone bad, right? Like, I mean,
it'd
it
be a
was
deal
I would
breaker.
say it was probably wouldn't have been a deal breaker because
Yeah.
I wouldn't have picked the kittens over I wouldn't have picked the kittens over him,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So, but it was
Yeah,
definitely a
sure.
sort of moment of like, we now have 2 cats. You didn't
Yeah,
really want us to get cats. You
right,
never
right, right.
explicitly said absolutely not. And so I kind of like use that like tacit, if it really matters to me, I guess I can do it. And I went for it, but knowing that it was going to cause tension and we were going to have to give it a month or two to before we knew for certain which way it was going to fall out, whether the kittens
Yeah.
were going to stay or not, right?
And
Like it's
yeah. I
so,
want to say one more thing about the toilet seat con hookup example.
go
You're
ahead.
pissed off
I,
about the
I,
toilet seat. I just want to talk about like how this relates to my experience and how it doesn't relate and like what, because I think
sure.
there was a piece in there where you're sort of like, well, this is the thing that poly people understand. Okay, so there's the or maybe I'm
Yeah.
stating that incorrectly, but I there was some piece of like the not sleeping with
I think
people
what
leads to the
it
toilet seat.
basically said is you cheat on your spouse because they've done some minor thing that irritated you, but right, and you were thrown by
So
that.
I mean, I'm just like not in a million years, but I do get the minor thing. So here's what I would point to as the um as the commonality or as the generalization or whatever, which is that I think that so you have the person who the toilet seat um it was not put down. They're pissed off about it. They go. It's the accumulation of like a series of minor things that has bred bitterness in their heart. Like
Hmm.
it seems like every individual thing seemed too petty to bring up, but the
Right.
accumulation of them has killed has poisoned the soul of the plant of their love, and now they are just like this seething mass of resentment. That I relate to a lot,
Right.
right? That I relate to a lot. Like if you don't watch it, and we had this crisis in our marriage where we were together for 7 years before Esther and I got married, and we were pretty good at it. And then we got married, and then about 6 months after we got married, we had this huge crisis where we're like practically hated each other.
Hmm.
And we were like, what is going on? And what I realized had happened is that we had relaxed. Like
Mm.
when we were going out this whole 7 years, we lived in different continents. We really didn't know if this was going to be a thing. We always had a principle that the people in the relationship were more important than the relationship. We would always put each other over
Mm.
our relationship. You know what I mean? Like if it's
Right.
the best thing for you to break up with me, you should damn well break up with me
Yeah. No, I
because
would
I care
agree.
about you,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
That was our guiding principle. And then we got married and we were like, okay, well, we decided that permanently it is going to be the best thing for us to be together. Like we've done enough research, we've reached our conclusion, like this is going to be and what happened was we were like, okay, well, good, that's it, we did it. You know what I mean? Like, we sort
Yeah.
of, and then it started, and two things happened. One was that therefore, when somebody was like, previously we'd had a fight about something, we'd be like, okay, is this the fight? Is this the breakup? Is this going to be the thing? So we really put our full attention on it. Like,
Right.
oh, you don't agree with me, or like you
Yeah.
won't be
Yeah.
aren't willing to do this, or you're not going to. And we were like, all right, well, all right, let's bring our best thinking to this, because if this means we should break up, we care about each other more
Hmm.
than the relationship. So, but afterwards we were like, well, we're not going to break up, so like, why are we having this fight? You know what I mean? We said, well, we might as well let it go. Like, oh, you left the toilet, whatever.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happened, of course, is that because we were married now, we had like 60 years of extrapolated time. So if somebody left the toilet seat up, it wasn't just them leaving the toilet seat up once. It was like, I can think forward in my mind to 60 years of them leaving the toilet seat up, right? It's like an
So
unendurable. And the combination of those two things, of the like, well, we're not going to sweat the small stuff, and the like, the small stuff is actually like 60 years of small stuff, was driving us nuts. And we realized that we had to actually fight more, not less. Like it was like even more,
yeah.
like before we'd had this seriousness of like, is this going to be the thing that breaks us up? But now we were like, you know what? Living in hell for 60 years is way worse than breaking up. So now we really have to think about this.
I do think, I mean, I agree with all of that. I do think that don't sweat the small stuff. I want to pull out a little bit because
Yeah.
I think there's a way in which people get married and then kind of rely on marriage the fact that you're
Yeah.
marriage to fix everything
Yeah.
and so I think that's some of what you're talking about with
Yeah.
relaxing and like not doing the work and
Yeah.
whatever. I do think to some extent that's okay because you have sort of built a sheltering structure, right? You've built, by getting married, you've built a house for yourself and put a roof over the relationship, and you don't have to dash around to get out of the way of every little bit of rain, right? Like the structure can absorb it. I think the way I usually think about it is with splinters, in that you get a splinter and and my Mac is almost out of power, so we really are going to have to stop soon. But you get a splinter, and some splinters are like tiny pieces of wood that you're having trouble getting it out, and it's okay because it is literally going to dissolve into your skin. It's going to be a little irritation for a bit, but it's going to break down, and then it's gone, and it doesn't matter. And then other splinters are I mean, I'm not saying it's really wood versus glass, but other splinters are big enough and hard enough and firm enough, whatever, that they're not going to break down. And you might even be able to live with it, but it will be a constant irritation.
Hmm.
Every time you take a step, you're going to feel it in your heel. And that's the kind of thing that you can't rely on the marriage, the fact that you're married, to fix, right? Like the fact that you made this
Yeah.
agreement. Like, so there are ones that you can, like, like, here's a small irritation that I can, like, smooth over. We can accept it. Don't sweat the small stuff. And then there's the other kind that has to be addressed. And I think
I mean,
being able
and
to tell the difference is
yeah.
right.
Well,
Like,
I think I would say that it is about my point is less about that you should never sweat that you should always sweat
yeah,
every
yeah,
small stuff, but that you shouldn't fool yourself about what you can.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Like the
yeah,
thing
yeah,
about your splinters is a good analogy because it's like, well, I would always take out every splinter, but if there was a splinter I was going to leave in, it would be because I was like, "Oh, well, I actually don't care. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
not like I will just every day put my effort on pretending that I don't care
yeah,
about this splinter, but like it
right.
sounds like you are sometimes just like, oh, I recall that I had a splinter 3 weeks ago. Oh, look,
Yeah,
still there,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like, so if that's the kind of person you are about splinters, which I am not, then like you know what I
yeah.
mean. But I mean, it's like if you are
This is
aesthetically,
this is
it's the
particularly funny because Ben has in fact taken a splinter out of my hand at one point.
indeed.
So it's
And I am very good at it because I hate splinters. The point is that the line between not actually letting something go and pretending to let something go those feel very close, and they are in fact
yeah,
not at all
yeah.
similar.
Yeah, no, you
And
can't pretend to let it go. That doesn't
and
work at
me and
all, right?
Esther are both very harmony-seeking people by nature. We are both have a very
Mhm.
strong incentive, and we both look good in our own eyes if we don't make a big deal and let things go. So it is an
Mhm.
enormous discipline to force ourselves to bring up objections that feel petty. We feel like I am a
Yeah,
petty asshole for making this objection to doing this thing, but like, and so I am like, we both have
yeah,
this absolute impulse to like be like, whatever, it's fine. But if it's actually not fine, that's corrosive.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, and I
And
think that's been something that I wouldn't have phrased myself as a harmony seeking individual, but like, I asked Kevin at one point, like, am I low maintenance or high maintenance? And he said, you're generally very low maintenance with occasional periods of very high maintenance, right?
occasional
Like, and
spikes.
but I think I am somewhat invested in being the low maintenance girlfriend,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
easygoing person who's like, oh, it's not a
Yeah.
big deal. And so I think I have the same thing. I actually think it caused huge problems for us because I think, we had a stretch in the middle where we were really fighting a lot about serious relationship stuff, and a, and part of that was coming out of me feeling like I couldn't ask for things or shouldn't ask for things, right? Like
Mhm.
that was sort of too much to ask for. And so I did a lot of, like, stifling, and once I stopped doing that, at some point I
Yeah.
just kind of stopped. Everything got better, and I think it is an
Yeah.
ongoing thing I have to remind myself of because I do still have that habit of, like, I'm getting irritated with him. Is this, like, I should probably stop and talk to him about it, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I have to make myself do that. But it's always
Wh-
better. It's always
Let me
better
just
when I
come back
solve it.
for
So,
one last moment to
yeah.
the toilet seat con hookup.
Okay. And then let's
Because
finish this
I
off.
was
So,
saying there's
yeah.
a part that I relate to and there's a part that I don't relate to. So the thing about like, oh, the resentment of like, oh, it's another damn thing on top of all the things that I'm swallowing and now I have this
Yeah,
brooding
yeah.
bitterness, can totally relate to that. And I understand the person who in that circumstance then meets the attractive person is like, you would always put up the toilet seat and then they have like a flame.
Mhm.
Like I conceptually as a character, I can
Yep.
understand how I could write such a character, I think.
You could write that
So
character. Yep.
but here's the thing. I think that what I relate to that in my own life, what I think is there are these little things, and then there are structural things. And for people who, my friends who are poly, who've had this experience of like, oh my God, once I started doing this other way, it was so much better. It's like there was something structurally wrong with the agreement, like we are not going to sleep with other people. That it was a chafing thing, and therefore the toilet seat is like when it triggers this like I am going to sleep with this other person who put up the toilet seat, it's like it's perhaps in this. I mean, I may be reading too much into your analogy, but because maybe there are other reasons why maybe they just whatever were defying their own principles in some other way, or I don't know. But it seems to me like maybe the print that like their agreement was not in harmony with their true nature. So the things that I can relate to is when often when we have some fight that's a lot of little things building up, what I have learned to do is be like, and we get caught in the like, well, you said this and this, blah, 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 and I'm like, what is structurally wrong here? So the last one of these was
Mm-hmm.
that we were fighting about something about chores, and
Mm-hmm.
I was like, you need me to take charge of the kitchen floor. I just need to
Mm-hmm.
own the kitchen floor being clean. Like that, it wasn't necessary. You know what I mean? It was sort of, it wasn't, it was tangentially related, but it wasn't necessarily like actually like that she had thought that. But I was like, this will keep happening. This irritation
Yeah,
about
yeah,
something
yeah,
being like will recur unless we shift the domain of responsibility that is now my, like, you know what I mean? That's like
yeah.
and I don't know, maybe that's not a good example, but it's like it's like, I wonder if the person, cheating at the con because of the toilet seat is, you could say, well, people are just going to cheat because the other person is, but I think maybe what that is that's a person for whom the agreement of monogamy does not actually support them, because I think I would feel like it just feels like you know what I mean? Like it's just so not that would be like, how for me that would feel like, how when you're at you're really mad about your spouse, and then you go to a hardware store and you're just like, I'm gonna drill my hand. you know Natural. You want to
I
stick a
think
drill in
maybe
your
the
hand.
piece that you're missing, I think, is that
Yeah.
it's not just that you're mad at your spouse, really. It's that the the things that they have been doing have convinced you on a fundamental level that this agreement that you thought you had, you don't actually have. So the marriage has already unraveled. It has already
Hmm.
broken because of things they have done. And that's then what makes it feel like, well, now like it's done and it's over. I can, I fundamentally lost this thing. Now I can do what I want, what I might do as a free agent. And maybe what I want to do is sleep with this person because it would be fun. Maybe I want to sleep with this person because I'm furious at my ex now, essentially, and I want to hurt them, and this is a great way to hurt them, right? But it's um like I think that I think both of those could be those are very different use cases, right? Of
Yeah.
where someone
I
might
mean,
go
it
with
is very,
this.
and also, of
But
course, different if you're like, it is, of course, different if you're like, oh, this means that the relation, well, in this case, I now want to leave you, but it does seem
yeah,
like you
but I
could
think
just
even
send a
if you even if you
text.
but even if you don't maybe you're feeling a
How
little
long does it take
angrier,
to send
right?
a text?
Or but I think the basic thing is like I think it often I mean, I can't speak. I've cheated on someone once, and it was like, again, 30 years ago. So it's not any of these situations. So but I think the use the I think what happens, at least some of the time, is that people feel like I have already been betrayed, right? Like whatever I thought I was agreeing to clearly is
Mhm.
not actually in effect. And so I'm now free to do other things, right?
I mean, I
So
get, right, but but, and I don't know. I mean, we could be talking about any number of situations, and people do all kinds of things, and the world is large. But I guess I'm just saying, if the thing where you're like, now the dam has broken, and I'm going to do the thing, it feels like the scenario you're painting. The person is like, it has taken me so much effort to hold back from this thing that I've wanted to do, and now that I feel like this thing I was getting in exchange for that, like it was a balance. Maybe it was worth it because I gave up this thing, but in exchange I got this other thing. But now that I found out the other thing is not what I thought it was, and that the deal is off. Oh my God, that dam is broken, and now this enormous pressure that had been keeping me from doing this thing is now finally I can do the thing. You know what I mean? And that,
okay, so I see what you're saying. I think we have to stop, but I
yeah,
think I
this is the
understand
part that I
now
don't
that
relate to, is what I'm saying.
I think, well, I think also I think you see monogamy differently than I see monogamy. So, because
Hmm.
from what you're saying, it sounds like your version of monogamy has someone who doesn't feel an impulse to sleep with other people all the
No, no,
time. And
I'm not. That's Well, no, I'm not saying that's my version of monogamy. I'm just saying that. I'm not saying. I mean, no, I expect there are lots of monogamous people who manage to be monogamous despite having the urge to sleep with people all the time. That's I know many such people, and I think that's great. Like, more power to them.
yeah,
But
yeah.
and I'm not saying that I'm whatever. I'm not like
But that's kind of like what
uh
you're framing it as, like maybe the fundamental structure of monogamy is not right for them, right? It was kind of what you
Well,
were
I guess
saying
that's
before. And
so it's a different. I think the goalpost shifted because I wasn't actually
yeah,
initially seeing the example as like, and therefore I want to end this relationship, and I'm so mad I'm not going to text. Like that's sort of there's two additions. One is A, I have actually decided that this is not the relationship for me, and B, like I am too mad to text them or call them, so I'm going to. I don't know. This like it became a different story. But I guess what I was saying is for the person for whom it's more like the cats, like for it's a lapse. Like you brought home the cats and it was like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay, it turned out to be okay because that's the original context we were talking about was not like I'm leaving you over the toilet seat. It was more like this is a tension and maybe it would be better without. Originally, you were saying maybe this would be healthier without so many rules, right? So it wasn't necessarily I'm leaving over. This is like
So again,
this would
I'm
be
not.
better if we
Yeah.
treated this as like
So my question is, you know, let's say you are invested in being a rules follower in this particular way. You have agreed to this thing. There's a moment in Bejeweled, right, where um Ekaterin and Miles are talking about this, and Ekaterin is really, really struggling about the fact that she left her husband. Sorry, a spoiler, but in an earlier book, and uh, and she says, "I went from being the kind of person who would take a life oath and to someone who would break one," right? And for her, in her paradigm, like that it was sort of impossible in the old paradigm to break the oath, right? She had to become a different person in some sense to be able to walk away from this thing that she had sworn. And so I guess what I'm interested in here are I don't know, the distinction between how hard we hold ourselves to these rules, and you can apply this right back to writing, right? Like if I'm writing a sonnet and I've got, the ABABCDCD EFEFGG structure, and I'm writing this poem, and partway through I realize the word I really, really want to use is not going to rhyme the F, right? And so the right word for the poem is going to break the sonnet form. And there's a fork in the road there, right? Because there are sort of hard prescriptivists who would say that you're engaged in a project, and if you go off and do something else, that's fine, but it's not a sonnet anymore, right? It's now some variant of free verse, essentially, right? um,
sure,
and I think that's so I just think that's interesting. I think that's interesting in terms of life. I think it's interesting in terms of genre and how hard we hold to the genre boundaries, right? If someone goes off in a very, very experimental direction, there is a way in which they leave the original conversation. I think that's part of what interests me, right? And they're now in a new and a different conversation. So
sure.
if you're the group of women who are sitting around, my aunties, my let's say my great aunties who I didn't know well, but back in the era where you were Catholic, you got married and you endured whatever, your drunken husband, your wife beating husband, your whatever, you had no options, right? They could sit around and have a conversation, and they are all engaged in the same project, right? As opposed to
Hmm.
my aunt who became a nun, right?
Hmm.
And went off to do a very, very different project instead, right? And they're living in different worlds at that point. Does that
I
make
see what you're
sense? And
saying.
like,
Let me. But I'm
yeah.
a little. So I am totally willing to let go of the relationship conversation and go back to genre.
Okay.
We don't have to talk about it. May be that you're not interested in talking about the thing that I'm not talking. What I'm interested in talking about, which
Yeah.
is okay. But I do feel sort of like we brushed past the thing I was talking about. So I am engaged in the same project as your auntie, as your great aunties, because I am never, ever, ever, ever going to fucking divorce Esther.
Okay.
That's my project. Now, I mean, who knows? Obviously, if it would save a life, I guess I would. Like, I suppose I could come up with some extremely abstruse scenario where,
Mhm.
like, I don't know. But, like, even if she had a brain tumor and was going on murdering people, I would
Sure.
not divorce her, right? So that's not my. That now, again, like, I don't know. Does that, who, the proof is in the pudding, maybe I'll eat these words, right? Who knows, right? We do
Right.
certainly live in a culture. It's very different being in a cultural context. One thing is being in a cultural context that Now, it's possible you might say, well, my great aunties were not even engaged in that project because there was no other option. It wasn't they were like engaged in the
Yeah,
project of making sure they didn't divorce their husband because he was not even in the picture. I don't know, but I mean, maybe, right?
yeah,
But if
yeah.
we're saying the project is stay with this person forever, that is completely my
Well,
project.
so no, so
So
that's
when I
interesting because that's,
say,
and I'll just say that's not
yeah,
mine, right? Like Kevin and I got married, but it
yeah,
was not with that intent on either
no, I
side. I
get
think
that, I get that.
it's very much a, you know, the getting married is a we plan to stay together for as long as it makes both of us happy, and if at some point one or the other of us isn't, then well, we're going to have some legal stuff to untangle, and but
I mean,
that's
that's very
okay.
sensible, and I'm not even sure why I'm so attached to the idea of not. I mean, I'm not so sure why it's.
I didn't
I
know
have
you were,
no
so that's
idea.
interesting.
I have
So,
no idea why I'm so
yeah.
repelled by the notion of divorcing Esther. I think just that it was this very. And it's not that I think it's a bad idea for people to get divorced. I think it's a great idea for lots of people to get divorced. I think there are plenty of people who I think, there's plenty of people I think maybe they'd be very much happier when they get divorced. And I amazingly am for people being happy. It came as something of a surprise to us that we were interested in this project getting staying together forever. But I think that it is like we started out with this relationship where we're absolutely like we put the people before the relationship.
Mhm.
We we will end this relationship the minute it is no longer serving the people in it, right?
Mhm.
And the people are of absolute paramount. And then there was 7 years of that, and that never went away. And then we reached a point where we were like, and on top of that, without diminishing that one bit, like we can on top of that add in addition the extra goal of like, and we're also going to stay together forever.
Mhm.
I mean, and that's kind of like it's like, and so I don't. I mean, you said something about like some people feel like marriage in and of itself solves these problems. I mean, I don't know, but my experience is marriage is like from my point of view, it's expert mode, right? Like it's like we made the relationship much harder.
Mhm.
Like it's much more difficult because it took us 7 years to get reasonably good at the let's have this relationship that's designed to make both people happy and we can toss it at any time if it's not doing that. And then
Right.
we had to keep that goal because we don't want to be miserable, right?
Mhm.
But then adding on top of it the goal, and guess what? Bonus, now you've leveled up. Now bonus points. Do that. It's like do this, but like left-handed. Like do this, but also you can't leave. Like that's, I mean, you can leave, but like play to not leave. Play to have it
Right.
pay for keeps, right? That's not easier. It's not like getting married solves anything. That makes it harder in a way, right?
I think when the people who I think sometimes rely on marriage to fix things, um, being married, it's and I feel like I want to be really careful not to come across as judgmental here because I think what I'm trying to get at is that our society sends out this message is kind of more
Mm-hmm.
what troubles me about all of this, especially to young women, saying getting married will fix your problems, will fix your relationships. It is the goal, right?
Yeah,
And then, why do we have all of these romantic comedies? And, why is it that
right,
at the
right.
holidays, I've got a
Yep.
t-shirt that's like about like all I want to do is bake and watch rom-coms, right? Like
Yeah,
that's, so
sure.
it's a comfort. That's very much
Mm-hmm.
a comfort thing, right? This idea
And it's old too.
of
That's how Shakespeare comedies end. They get married. We're done.
that's right. So like happily ever after. And so the then the difficulty is that we don't give a roadmap for everything afterwards, right? And maybe that's because there's what's that line, that all happy families are the same and all unhappy
Mm-hmm.
families, I should know
Mm-hmm.
who that is. It's a famous opening to a novel. All unhappy families are unhappy in their own way, something like that.
Yeah.
um, and so maybe it is that the arc of going towards marriage is somewhat similar, and then there is no roadmap for what comes after
Well, I
that,
mean,
as you
I think that that's a really interesting cultural conversation because I actually, and I love, I think there, I miss more, particularly in certain genres. I miss like fiction or like engagement, like narrative about like married people. I love The Thin Man. There's like Nick and Nora
Yeah,
in the
those are
classic
great.
detective stories where this is,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah,
lovely because you just enjoy the fact that they're
yeah,
like, I mean, they just seem like they have a real relationship. Like sometimes
yeah.
they're sort of drolly snarking at each other, and then but they have each other's backs, and sometimes they're pissed off at each other. Like, it just
Mhm.
seems like a real dynamic and active and interesting relationship, and they're
Yeah.
solving mysteries. So it's just kind of in the background of that. But I really like that, and I feel like
Yeah, there aren't
that's
that many examples, right? I'm trying to think,
yeah,
like,
it's a
there's
gap in pop culture.
Dorothy Sayers. I love what she does with the sequence that leads up to Gaudy Night, and then
Hmm.
but she comes back to it with Busman's Honeymoon, so you do actually get to see them
Okay,
married, right?
yeah.
And then um, Bujold again
Bujold. Yeah,
does
I
it
was
with
gonna say
Miles and
Bujold is
Nectarine,
actually
right?
a great example.
Bujold
There are
even
these,
takes it. I mean, she takes it.
yeah,
Spoilers. She takes it like all the
yeah. There are
way to the end of
multiple.
this, right?
Mhm.
So.
There are multiple marriages and stuff. But yeah, but it's not so common. There's not so many outside.
Mhm.
It's either often. I mean, our especially like science fiction fantasy sort of full of like runaway orphans and like
Yeah.
loners, hard bitten loners, and I don't know, just a million like just like not married people. And it's funny that when I got married, I had a brief period where I started listening to country music because they're actually country music is a genre in which there are lots of songs that are about married. The drama is
Mm.
happening in
Right, right.
marriages. A lot of them are like cheating songs or like drinking songs. She took away the keys to my car, but she forgot about my old John Deere. So I could
Yeah.
drive down on my tractor down to I don't know, it was like absurd. Some of them are
Mhm.
silly, but there's a lot of like very serious,
Yeah.
like we are sticking together, you know, all these years, whatever. Um, but but it's largely absent from pop too. Like I don't really listen to country that much, and like pop music and hip hop and everything. Like there's not that many songs that are
Right,
about like. I
I
mean,
mean,
there's
this is
always
where
like every
I wanna pull in, like, a film person to, like,
sure,
because I'm thinking, like, Bollywood has, like, this
uh-huh,
whole genre of tearjerker movies, right, which I
yeah,
don't know a
yeah,
lot about, but I think some of them are after marriage, right, and
yeah,
it's about
yeah,
navigating all of this, and
hmm,
Hollywood, I think, doesn't have the same tradition, right? Does it?
yeah.
There's
There's not. I mean,
no,
there's
no, actually, I'm gonna say there's an exception to this. There is a
mhm,
whole set of movies about women in their 40s, 50s,
mhm,
60s. It's usually presented as a set of old friends from college who are
mm,
now getting together
yeah,
and they are unhappy in their lives and they have to reinvent themselves. Sometimes
mhm,
some of them are widows.
mhm,
If for the older ones, sometimes quite a few of them center around like having built up a facade of having a perfect life
mhm,
and then tearing it down and admitting to your nearest and dearest friends,
yeah.
girlfriends, importantly, girlfriends, what's really going on with you. So I
But
think
again, those are
that's,
less about marriage and more. Those are people who are married people, but
but
those
often
conversations aren't.
but often they're about marriage. I think
Yeah, yeah,
out of the
yeah,
four women in the room, often like three of them, the issue is marriage related, and
yeah,
sometimes all four, right?
yeah, yeah.
So in one
But
way or another,
when you're
yeah,
describing, it's not like when Nick and Nora is like, oh, we are actually on the text
right.
seeing how a marriage happens. A scene where the two women are talking about what's happening in their off-screen marriages. Is that, you know what I mean? Is that quite the same thing?
Well,
I
it's a
mean, maybe
different
half the
lens.
scenes
No,
are,
no, it's a
yeah,
different lens, and I think it's interesting. Why are the men not part of these conversations, right? Like, why is there a whole
mhm,
genre of movies
yeah.
about marriages, but only the women are the ones dissecting and analyzing and so on? There is another nice spin on it, though, is Frankie and Grace, right?
Mm, yeah,
Have you seen that one yet?
yeah. I've seen a
No.
bit of it. Bit of it.
Yeah, because you get like the premise of Frankie and Grace is that you've got these two couples who uh the men have been carrying on an affair for some time and the marriages end, the men get together and the women become roommates for a while
But again,
and
it's
that
telling that while we're thinking movies, you're like, here's a movie about marriage. It literally begins when the marriage is over. Like movies,
no no
like
no
there's
but
this genre of movie that end as soon as the marriage happens, and you're talking about a show that begin the marriage is over. Okay, now roll the camera, right?
Well,
I
but
mean,
I
it's
think
interesting.
what's
It's like a
interesting
gap.
is it is a gap, except that the men then get married, right? Like, so you do
Yeah, yeah,
actually you
okay.
see
So
them, their
there's a marriage.
side of
Yeah,
it is the
yeah,
marriage, right? And so, actually, I can't remember if they actually get married, but they make a
yeah.
life
They're
partnership.
uh-huh.
So, um, yeah. I would
Well,
agree.
and then the other thing
Generally,
is
there's a huge gap. So,
the other thing is that the other category of shows are sort of big family multi-generational family drama shows, sort of like
sure,
Parenthood or like The Fosters actually is a great, which often the focus on the kids, but like the marriage is very important
I
in the
haven't seen The
Fosters or
Fosters. I watched. Oh
or
yeah.
like Atypical or I mean
Hmm.
there's a sort of often centered around the kids, but where the parents are
Hmm.
important. Like it's like parents in marriages insofar as the parenting or the kids are having adventures and but the parents are important characters or something. like sometimes we get. But I don't know, it's just interesting. It's just a relative dearth of like narrative that's about like,
All
oh,
right, so
this is
if
how.
you were my student, I would say, well, that's fine. This is what we call a fire is hot paper. You've pointed out
Mm,
something factual, right? Now you've got to turn
uh-huh.
it into an argument. What's interesting? Like, why do you think this is, right? Why is it that in Western culture today, we have a dearth of stories about that really go into marriage in any depth?
Yeah, but it is a, like a fire is hot now observation. It's like because I don't think that's a universal. I think we've
Yeah, yeah,
particularly have this sort of. I mean, I think it partly has to do
yeah.
with this idolization of youth and this,
Hmm.
and I don't know. I think also it's the flip side of the rom com thing where marriage was traditionally this end of the story, and so it is one of these things
Yeah.
where it's like we don't imagine past the end. And there's also this way in which I see this in my own life, where it's like there's something about marriage that uh, it almost like it turns what was a public discourse into a private discourse in certain regards. Like my friends, like it was really interesting when everybody was dating and having heartbreaks and this and that, when
Hmm.
we were in our 20s or 30s, and everybody was like, who will they end up with? And there's sort of like this drama which where when you were talking about it, like it was very quick, like you could sit down with your friend and without it being an enormous intimacy or a potential betrayal of trust or something, you were just like, yo, my God, I this happened, or like, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
There's a lot, it's eventful. And there's a way in
Right.
which you sit down with your even, I mean, it's not that I don't tell my closest friends what's going on in my marriage, but it does seem like a whole different thing. It doesn't, on the surface, it doesn't seem that eventful. You know what I mean? It's not like, and then,
Yeah.
and
I
it's
mean,
also like, I don't know,
well,
it's
so
interesting.
there's a depth, right? Like, so Kevin
But
and I were
yeah,
involved with this woman, Karina, for 3 years, right? And
yeah.
she was Australian, lived in Australia, and she would come and live with us during her. She was a grad student, so she'd live with us during her summer break, which was our winter, and then go back to Australia for 9 months. And we did that for 3 years. And I would say there are various reasons why that relationship ended, but one of the main ones I think is that we couldn't, and this was before the not before the internet, but before the web. Really, it was like the very very
Mhm,
early days, so there was no free calling or anything like
mhm,
that, right? And we didn't have a lot of money, so mostly we were maintaining the relationship over 9 months via email, which does
mhm.
not
Yeah,
work very well,
tough.
very
Yeah.
difficult, right? And and what happened is that Kevin and I living together, our relationship got deeper and deeper, right? There's
Mhm,
a there's a layeredness to it, and we couldn't get our relationships with Karina to progress at the same speed, right? So we
yeah.
got more and more out of sync as time went on. Is I think a lot of what happened. And so when we talk about dating time in college or whenever that is, right? There's a shallowness in terms of
Mhm,
you haven't spent that much time with the person,
mhm,
right? And so it's relatively easy to recap like all the relevant stuff for a
mhm,
conversation with a friend. I would say now in the last few years, I'm now almost 50. Some of my college friends and I have gotten back in touch through Facebook or whatever and have been doing some of this kind of like deep excavation of our marriages and our lives and et cetera, so on, weekends away or long phone calls or so and the like. And I mean, it's almost like going to a shrink, right? You have to
mhm,
like sit and have these like, okay, I now have to tell you the 25 things that go into
mhm.
this thing
Yeah,
I actually want to talk
yeah.
about,
This
right?
whole
And
chain of, yeah, right.
so partly it's just a pragmatic issue. I wonder, like there's just a practical level of it's hard to excavate the depth of what happens in a marriage.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think it becomes sort of an opaque text. It's not just
yeah,
that you're spending so much time, but when you are, and I mean, we're saying marriage as if it's a binary, but of course, like
yeah, yeah,
it doesn't really matter if you're literally married. It's sort of like as as people in our culture, we have this cultural practice of sort of coupling up and then spending an enormous amount of your time with, like the pie chart of how much time you spend with this one person.
right,
You know what I mean? Like back in my 20s, it was like, well, it was a good chunk was this person, and then there was this friend, and then there was that, and then at some point, it just
right.
the pie chart is,
Well,
and particularly
and especially if you have children, right?
and if you
Which
have
then,
children, yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And part of it is, as you say, like there's so many details and so many interactions. It's like it's partly if you're like going out with your on a date and then going to talk to your friend and then going to talk to your other friend. It's like they're getting inevitably like little updates of, you know what I mean, like it's happening sort of in real time. And if it's this dense text of like 2,000 of interactions that have happened since the last time you
Yeah.
talked to them, it becomes an opaque text. And I think it's a chicken and egg cycle too, because we don't necessarily have the language to talk about it, partly because it's hard to talk. You know what I mean? I think there's also like the dearth of narrative that we consume about it to
Mm-hmm.
some extent. Not
Yeah.
always. I mean, I suspect it is depend on what genres you're into, because I think there probably are genres that are of
Yeah.
narrative production that are more interested in what happens in a marriage, right? Certainly a lot of like, I don't know, like Ann Tyler novels are, lots of it are like the
I'm
detail,
not
quiet
familiar, but
details of,
yeah.
well,
Okay.
you know, sort of
Well,
literary fiction
and
of,
actually, yeah, 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 and there's that whole genre of women's fiction, which I admit I'm not that familiar with, and so
yeah,
it may be that people are going to be listening to this, being like, "But what
what are
about
you
this
talking
entire
about?
genre?" Right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
No,
maybe
no,
we
there
just
is.
don't
I mean,
know.
there
So
is a
yeah,
whole chunk. I think in
yeah.
some ways it's interesting because there's something about
But in science fiction and
science
fantasy,
fiction and fantasy, which is
there's
sort
not
of
so
like,
much. There's Barbara Hambly's Dragon Slayer is a good example. Have you run
mm-hmm,
across that one?
no,
No? Oh, it's a great novel. It is from the point of view of a woman who's married to this man who is the dragon slayer, but she's trying to be a sorceress, and that
mm-hmm,
means that she has left him with the kids and gone
yeah,
off to live in a tower
uh-huh.
to do the things that sorceresses
Nice,
do. And
nice,
it's just, I don't know, Hambly does a really great job of bringing all of that to a classic fantasy story, because of course a dragon does show up, and her husband is like the sweetest, most scholarly kind of guy with
uh-huh,
the spectacles, but he happens to also be the dragon slayer, and so he
yeah.
has to go
So
off
he's
and
got
deal
to
with this. And
put down the
I
spectacles.
don't know, it's
Have you
sorry, that's
read?
a little segue, but I guess uh, it seems like
Yeah,
part of the question is, why is science fiction fantasy maybe a little bad at representing this kind of long-term complex relationship? And we're running out of time, so I'm gonna put forth one thing, a thought to end on for me, and then maybe you'll have something to end on. But one thing I tell my students is that there's a reason why in, say, university creative writing classes, a lot of faculty don't want students to bring in science fiction and fantasy. In fact, there are a couple of reasons. One reason is general prejudice against the genre. Putting that aside, not very interesting. Second reason is they're often unfamiliar with it, and so
yeah,
the faculty feel unconfident in their ability to critique and work with the
mhm,
text,
sure,
which is fair. And then, but the third reason is that they say it's going to be bad, that and that is not just a prejudice, that
mhm,
is based on accurate assessment of what they see in the classroom, because it's what I see in the classroom, and I love
yeah,
science fiction and fantasy, but on average beginner science fiction and fantasy stories are, I think, worse than beginner realist stories. And it took me a while, but what I've come to after 2 decades of doing this now is, I think it's because we're trying to do more, right?
mhm.
And so, if a
More skill
regular
sets.
story, sorry?
There are more skill sets.
There are more skill sets, right? If a regular story you're trying to do point of view and character and voice and setting, etc., and you're juggling these things and you're learning how to do it as you're writing it, and etc. You're master as a beginner. You've got all these tools that you don't really know how to use, and you're whatever. I was about to go off into this whole metaphor about hammers, and I'm putting it aside. But
Just leave time
the
for my summation.
that's right. That's right. But when you then have to add in world building, and you have to add in maybe building out a magic system, and you have to add in all of
Uh-huh.
establishing what kind of
Exposition and,
fantasy is this, etc.
mhm,
It's like you've suddenly added a couple flaming torches to all these balls you were juggling, right? And so
yeah,
you're going to start dropping more of them, and so the work that comes in at the beginning is often really thin on some of the other elements like character or whatever else, right? And um, so where I was going to connect that to this is that maybe that's why in science fiction and fantasy we have, as a genre, neglected some of this kind of deep humanism that is hard to represent anyway, because it is so thick and dense and opaque. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Just like maybe we should, put a little lens on it and a focus and be like, all right, we want to see your best marriage science fiction fantasy stories for this anthology.
Yeah,
And
that would be good.
okay,
All
I'm
right, I've
turning
got
to
like
you.
5 things,
Yes,
and
go.
you're running out of time. Okay, first of all, humanism. You keep saying that word. We need to have we need
Yeah,
to have
yeah, it's gonna be a big
an
conversation.
episode about what that means. Two, I understand what you're saying. I have a certain skepticism. I just you've distracted me by the point about about professors taking. I'm sure that's professors' experience. I wonder if their metric. Everybody's, their metric for, I expect literature professors' metric for quality, or creative writing professors' metric for quality, is influenced by their being creative writing professors, right? So there being high standards for like craft, characterization, depth, like those things. Like I don't know. I'm not. I wonder if I would have the same reaction, because like I wonder whether
I think you
my
would. I've been in critique groups with you. I think you would. So, but
but
we'll
like
come
if
back.
something's a bad story,
I don't know.
but
That's
if
that's
something's
a
a
whole
bad
episode in and
no,
of
but if I'm gonna
itself. But
if I
yes,
know I'm gonna read a bad story, this is this person is bad, and
yeah.
and either it's going to be I don't know. What I'm saying is like that what's the guy who's like the buddies, and the guy who writes in like where all the dinosaurs are having butt sex.
Oh
The
yeah, yeah. I know.
Tingle Tingle
Chuck Tingle.
Chuck Tingle, right? So okay, that's all I want to say about that is it's
Chuck
entirely
Tingle is
possible
Chuck
that
Tingle is
something
satire.
no
That's a
no
completely different genre. Anyway,
well,
okay,
that's a whole other conversation. But what I mean
okay.
is, if something was a complete mess, could not grammatically finish a sentence, but is full of like verve and weirdness, I might prefer to read that to something that's like a very common, modest, and appropriate. You know what I mean?
But
Anyway,
that
whatever.
wasn't the question, right? The question isn't like which things give you reader pleasure. The question is like, are there things that a beginner has more trouble handling because they're trying to juggle more stuff, right? Where 10 years
I was
down
just
the line,
reacting
they
to the
can
word
give you
better.
what?
I was only reacting to the word
I
better.
know you do this and Judd does this, and I think it's reactionary and dumb. So like it's
What's reactionary and dumb?
having
No,
this reaction to the word better because you take it as meaning something that is a value judgment that
no.
you get very defensive about it.
On the
Anyway,
contrary, I'm suggesting there's not a universal value judgment. I'm literally only defining it in terms of my pleasure. Like you said better. I think I would like the other one better.
poorly executed is is what I'm talking about. So when I
Anyway,
say better in
whatever.
this case, right? And I've been in critique sessions with you, and I am quite sure that you agree with
Okay,
me on this.
fair enough.
So
Fair enough. We could do an experiment. Anyway, whatever. So the last things I wanted to say, shout outs to Hanu,
hmm
also an interesting sort of a marriage. Also, oh my God, I'm so into this series, Elemental Logic series by Laurie Marks.
oh yeah.
Amazing. And that is, it's a very complex patchwork found family queer kind of thing, but at the heart of it, I think is a marriage of Karis and I'm blanking on
I
how do I
have to
say
go
it?
back
Anyway,
to it. I read the first one a long time ago, and I
so
never
that's
finished
that
the series.
it
Yeah.
has I mean in a way it has many complex many marriages that are subgroups inside of a complicated poly queer patchwork constellation, but it very much scratches that itch is what I'm saying. Like
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
long-term
hmm
interesting deep relationships that grow over the course of it. Um and I think that the reason, like if I'm gonna answer why is fire hot, I think my baseline reason is that um, science fiction roots are in stories of coming of age, right? So is
Mm,
the sort of
okay.
base expectation, through line, original idea of the genre is sort of like well, lone voyagers and sort of
hmm
coming of age stories, sort of people finding themselves, which is true of many kinds of popular literature,
Yeah. hmm
and yeah, I mean, and it's not just science fiction. I mean, that's like Shakespearean comedies all end in a marriage, right? They're all about young people. They're
Yeah.
also like about young people sort of finding their deal. And so
hmm
that's a baseline template. And I don't think that's worse. I don't think that makes them juvenile in comparison to more mature
No,
genres,
I don't think it does.
except in a literal sense. But it's just as interesting a field of human inquiry. But I do think that that's the sort of historical materialist roots of it, is that it's like that's what it comes out of, right? It comes out of
I would say that's an interesting contention, and I look forward to reading your paper laying out the details. But it's plausible. I will say, like, yeah, like, go ahead, go work on it some more. Write it out.
I don't know. I just feel
I
like
mean,
I just feel like
I
we
think of science.
listed.
I think of science fiction as, yeah, I would agree that coming of age. But when I think of fantasy, I feel like fantasy has different roots and different structures. But we have to wrap. I'm going to be really firm about
All
this
right,
because we have to wrap
sounds
because
good.
it's my I have
Go
to
to
go
your birthday
start
party.
my daughter's
Sounds
Zoom
good.
birthday
All
party.
right,
So this was
we'll talk
great,
later.
and we will be back. Okay.
Yep.